Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the CACE 2025 conference. We are honored to introduce our Levander lecturer, Dr. Adrian Hawkins, who will present a talk entitled Going There, Some Reflections on the Human Dimensions of Antarctic Conservation from the McMurdo Dry Valleys. Welcome, Dr. Hawkins.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone in Chile. Good afternoon from Bristol. It is a real privilege to have been invited to give the Luanda lecture today. At the beginning of my career as an Antarctic historian, Lisbeth Luanda was one of the most inspiring and supportive senior scholars working in the field. Her feminist perspective on Antarctic history modeled an approach that sought to be both critical and constructive, and it was a real inspiration for my work. Her early death was a blow to the field, and she has been sadly missed. I hope my talk this morning demonstrates something of the ongoing influence of Lisbeth Luanda on both my own work and on the field more widely. And I'm very grateful to the conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to give a lecture in her name. A little over 15 years ago, I sat down to write what would become one of my favorite articles. I had recently finished a PhD in the history of the sovereignty disputes among Britain, Argentina, and Chile in the Antarctic Peninsula. And I was getting started in a position teaching environmental history at Colorado State University in the United States. Almost without exception, when I would tell somebody that I was studying Antarctic history, their first question would be, have you been there? At the time, I hadn't been there. I had managed to write a perfectly fine PhD dissertation using archives in the United Kingdom, the United States, Chile, Argentina, and the Islas Malvinas. I was starting to publish articles on various aspects of Antarctic history and to engage regularly with the developing community of Antarctic historians that would, over time, develop into the SCAR Standing Committee on the Humanities and Social Science Group that we're meeting as part of this week. But I hadn't been to Antarctica. For my work as an early career professional historian, I had no real need to visit the Antarctic, and the repeated question of have you been there was starting to annoy me. But if I were being honest with myself, the real cause of this annoyance was that I really, really wanted to go to Antarctica. And the have you been there question repeatedly reminded me that I hadn't managed to find a way to visit. This made the question doubly frustrating. An invitation from the environmental historian Stephen Pine to contribute to a special issue of environmental history on extreme environments offered me an opportunity both to vent my frustration with the have you been there question and to explore the meaning and the importance of visiting the places we study as environmental historians. This theme connected me neatly with my more general idea that the polar regions are good places for doing environmental history because they intensify the visibility of the environment and offer completely different perspectives quite often. I'm repeatedly drawn to William Fox's idea of Antarctica as cognitive dissonance, a place that helps to make things simply strange simply by being what it is. In this case, by making it more difficult to visit Antarctica, Antarctica's extreme environment intensifies the questions about the importance of visiting the places we study. Similar questions have been explored more recently and with a lot more theoretical sophistication by scholars such as Anna Goasco and Bronte Raywood Evans, and I warmly recommend their work to anyone interested in the place of field work in contemporary scholarship. In my article, I explored the question of what it would mean to go to Antarctica. One thing I looked at, for example, was the sense of authority and legitimacy that you get from going there. I noted that almost every dust jacket or back cover of every book on everything to do with Antarctica had a picture of an author standing proudly in the Antarctic, wearing a brightly colored coat and smiling at the camera. Apologies here to Edward Larson, who just happened to be the first book I picked off my shelf. And it is interesting to note that he hasn't just gone to Antarctica for this image, he's gone all the way to the South Pole. I've also included my favorite exception to this rule from the Argentine Jorge Julio Motet's Reminiscences, which instead of having himself as the author in the picture, he has a picture of a woman called Mabel on skis and the caption, "Why would I return from Antarctica? Any other question?" Which is both a fascinating variation on the traditional hero picture and something that is somewhat problematic at the same time. And I was thinking that Elizabeth Luanda probably would have had a field day analyzing this image. In early meetings of the SCAR History Group, there would be one or two Antarctic scientists turned amateur historians who would start their talks by asking the audience who had been to Antarctica, and then proceeding to explain to those who didn't raise their hands exactly how Antarctic history really was. However, if we really want to understand the dominant experience of most people making important policy decisions in the history of Antarctica, I argued, for example, that the best thing we can do is not go there, since few of the most influential historical actors ever actually visited the continent. Here I would put up Argentine President Juan Domingo Perón as my exhibit A for this perspective. 15 or so years after writing Have You Been There, I have now visited Antarctica 8 times. Or if I'm trying to sound like a true insider, I'll say that I have done 8 seasons in Antarctica. 5 of these seasons have been working with the McMurdo Dry Valley's Long-Term Ecological Research, LTER site, in the continent's largest predominantly ice-free region, on tourist ships in the Antarctic Peninsula. Shamefully, as you will have noticed from the publicity photos for this talk, I have become one of those people who now uses a picture of themselves in Antarctica with a bright jacket, smiling at the camera to give some sort of legitimacy to my work. Something I've also done on websites for my courses that I teach here at the University of Bristol. This term, embarrassingly, due to the quirks of Blackboard Ultra course management software, I appear twice the size of my fellow instructors, looming large in my quest for Antarctic legitimacy. On a more serious note, the invitation to give the Luanda lecture offers an opportunity to reflect on the experience of going there, and to bring those experiences into dialogue with my early reflections on the importance of visiting or not visiting the places we study. Going to Antarctica has been a tremendous privilege, one that I recognized at the time, but I'm only starting to fully appreciate with reflection. Going there creates lots of thank yous, and I would like to thank everyone who has made this possible, and especially the Antarctica 21 Tourist Company and everyone connected to the Dry Valley's LTER site. For those of you not familiar with this part of Antarctica, the Dry Valleys are a predominantly ice-free region not far from McMurdo Station and Scott Base on Ross Island in the Ross Sea area, McMurdo Sound area. And the landscape looks something like this, a very desolate, barren, ice-free landscape. Particular thanks go to the 2 co-authors of much of my work on the McMurdo Dry Valleys, Steve Chignell and Andrew Fountain. Hopefully our book on the history of this region will be coming out soon, although I realize I have now been saying that for quite a while. Some of my reflections on the experience of going there directly relate to themes raised in the Have You Been There article. I stand by the claims that I made in the original essay that going there is not necessarily the best scholarly response for humanities and social scientists studying Antarctica. Alongside the question of which position best gets us into the shoes or boots of the people we study, if that is even possible for historical research, is the question of critical distance. Looking back on my earlier work on Antarctic history, before I had an opportunity to visit, there was perhaps a critical edge that I have started to lose by going there. It is harder, for example, to label scientists as pawns in a political game, as I may once have suggested, if you spend time living with scientists, working with scientists, and getting to know the scientists over a course of an Antarctic field season. To say nothing of becoming myself a similar pawn in a similar political game. Other reflections were more unexpected or spontaneous. I knew going down to Antarctica that national rivalries coexist with international cooperation. But experiencing this in person is a different experience. Flags fly all over the continent in symbols of what Klaus Dodds has labeled banal nationalism. This is something that I knew in theory, but it was fascinating to see on the ground, where it is both jarring and also largely uncommented on and unmentioned. Another observation is that scientists work hard. There is a real imperative to take advantage of being there, and that means that almost every available hour of potential work is taken advantage of by the scientists working in Antarctica. Another observation is that people matter in this continent as far away as you can get from large population centers. It is actually people who define your experience in Antarctica. You're stuck together for weeks at a time, quite often, with just a handful of other people, working together, living together, eating together. And this is quite an intense experience, often very positive, but potentially not if there are any difficulties. The people who go back to a place like the McMurdo Dry Valleys year after year develop a passion, a real passion for the continent and for the place. Others I've observed will go for one season and never come back. Some people don't get along with this landscape or with this place. The passion for those who do return sometimes borders on being transcendent or even a spiritual experience, which is something that I've become particularly interested in recent years after becoming a self-supporting minister in the Church of England, and something I'm starting to research within Antarctic history. A little more speculatively, I've noticed that a person's position on the scientific hierarchy often takes the place of social class in Antarctica, determining what you do and who you do it with, and even where you eat and where you drink. Although traditional social class, I would suggest, still does matter in shaping Antarctic history. Science, another observation is that science is not always as objective as it might appear from reading a scientific paper. I remember strongly a dilemma one afternoon when we were trying to measure a stream transect to measure the amount of water flowing down from glaciers into the lakes. And the dilemma was whether we should kick away an awkwardly placed rock that was making the depth measurement of the stream, where we decided to do our transect, inaccurate. So whether it would be better to move the stone or to leave it there, with no right answers really in that. The lessons and takeaways from going to Antarctica are numerous, and I could go on for most of this talk in a similar way. But I want to focus on one takeaway in particular. An important lesson that I learned from going to Antarctica is that humanities and social science research matters. In fact, I would state that even more strongly. Antarctic science needs the Antarctic humanities and social sciences much more than it currently thinks it does. Antarctica as a continent, a place, an ecosystem also needs the humanities and the social sciences in order to flourish. Here, of course, as a humanities scholar working in Antarctica, I might be accused of bias or simply having my pre-existing beliefs reinforced. He would say that, wouldn't he? Was one of the earliest phrases I learned to help with historical analysis. And it is very true in this case. But just because I'm biased doesn't mean that there isn't a desperate need for more integrated and influential humanities and social science research in Antarctica. The field of Antarctic conservation gives a particularly stark example of the need for humanities and social science research. Here I draw on a second definition of going there, as it is used in contemporary English, as saying something a little controversial, or perhaps even a little awkward. Are we really going to go there? Might be the exasperated opening comment of a difficult conversation. In the spirit of saying something a little controversial or awkward, I'm going to go there and say that to be more effective at achieving its goals, Antarctic conservation desperately needs more input from the humanities and the social sciences. I will start to make that case with a few mentions of some of the collaborative work that we have been doing in the McMurdo Dry Valleys that has a connection to conservation. My early work in this ice-free region focused on using historical research to extend the historical record further back in time. There was value in going there and being in the McMurdo Dry Valleys for this work. Most obviously, there were opportunities for rephotography, using original photographs taken by explorers and scientists from the heroic era. And this is a picture taken by Frank Debenham in 1911 in the Dry Valleys, looking down over Lake Fryxell, and another picture taken 102 years later, which shows that the lake just behind the glacier has actually risen considerably in that time. Another example of this using historical maps and contemporary satellite imagery shows for a different lake, this time Lake Bonney, just how much it has expanded in the 100 years since the early 20th century. This research has helped to reveal a dynamic environment where some parts of the ice-free landscape have changed quite significantly since Captain Scott, Edgar Evans, and William Lashley first set foot in this curious valley in December 1903. Along with mapping and GIS, rephotography has proved a useful point of connection with scientists on the McMurdo Dry Valleys LTER. These methods are familiar to scientists, for example, in glacier rephotography. And it quickly became apparent that rephotography not only had value in studying the early human history of the Dry Valleys, but also in the more recent history, and in particular in the question of human impacts and conservation. We use rephotography, for example, alongside archival research in relation to a human footprints study of Antarctica. This is what the landscape looks like now, and this was the historical photograph that we used to identify the location of the Asgard hut in this case. Unlike other parts of the continent, where the assumption is often that human presence is ever increasing, the record from the McMurdo Dry Valleys is that building footprint has peaked in the 1990s and is now, in fact, decreasing, suggesting perhaps that effective environmental management is taking place, especially since the number of scientific publications have also risen during this period, meaning there is more scientific output for less environmental impact. And this work we digitized using photographs and plans of stations such as Vanda Station to add up the footprint across the Dry Valleys. And this was the graph that we came up with, showing the drop-off from the peak in the 1990s. Similarly, we used archival research and rephotography for a project to sample soils around former sites of human occupation. And then we've measured invertebrate populations in those soils to get a sense of the lasting impact of structures in the Dry Valley ecosystem. The Dry Valley Drilling Project, for example, was a big science endeavor in the mid-1970s, early to mid-1970s, to understand the underlying geology of the region. And you can see from these photos that this was a very impactful project. And so we went back to the sites of this drilling and measured the nematodes to look for lasting impact. And this is one of those, the second of the two Dry Valleys drilling project sites. It is not a straightforward exercise since no control samples were taken before the field camps or drill platforms were constructed. And it's still a project that we are working on at the moment. But the initial results, as you can see from the heat map here, suggest that there is, in fact, a lasting impact at the center of these sites 50 years after the disturbance has been removed, although this appears to be quite localized. It suggests that we need to take a lot of care in placing new field camps in places like the Dry Valleys, because damage will be done. So choosing a site that will be used for as long as possible is much more preferable than using multiple locations. A related study has demonstrated that research sites in the McMurdo Dry Valleys get closer to field camps over time. And here, there's a lot of complex mathematics going on. It's actually the middle graph on the left-hand side, the important one here. But this also indicates that the decision of where to place a field camp is important, since the surrounding area is likely to see a lot more human activity after the field camp is in place. In effect, field camps might be thought of as magnets for scientific activity in the surrounding region. Less directly related to conservation, but potentially is the result of social network analysis on the scientific research conducted in the McMurdo Dry Valleys from the Heroic era up to 2017, which suggests that the scientific network of co-authored publications among different scientists actually mirrors the landscape itself, with, for example, hydrology acting as the link between glaciology and limnology in the social network in much the same way that meltwater streams link glaciers and lakes in the real landscape of the dry valleys. From an environmental management perspective, it is interesting, for example, to see where scientific articles directly focused on conservation fit into this social network. And you can see them in green in between soil science and biology, not too far from hydrology itself. And with all of this work, I would be very happy to provide references or further information for any of these studies if that would be useful. Most, but not all of this has been published. As well as the more practical contributions that humanities and social science perspectives can make to Antarctic conservation by working alongside scientific research, there are also important theoretical insights that our work can provide. Going there in this way to put Antarctic conservation into its wider social and cultural contexts raises all sorts of questions. Where does the power lie in the decision-making process? What is the motivation for conservation? What are the geopolitics of Antarctic conservation? Who is on the inside and who is on the outside? A recent example of a more theoretical contribution of humanities and social science perspectives for Antarctic conservation is Alejandro Mancilla and Peter Roberts' idea of the paradox of protection, which highlights that the greatest threats to the continent come from outside, largely in the form of climate heating. And as a consequence, there is a degree of powerlessness as to what can be done to protect Antarctica from within the continent, a degree of powerlessness that is not always recognized by policymakers. Another example of the value of the humanities and social sciences to Antarctic conservation would be the importance of the meaning of words. We are in the middle of some interesting work through the SCAR Anticon group, the Integrated Science to Inform Antarctic and Southern Ocean Conservation, on inviolate areas in Antarctica. I'm sure literary scholars on this call would have a field day with the meaning of the word inviolate. And there are also interesting cross-cultural similarities and differences among the official languages in the Antarctic Treaty, which creates some interesting tensions in Antarctica. Although not formally an inviolate area, the Barwick and Balham Valleys, which you can see at the very top left of this map, circled in red, are an ASPA, an Antarctic Specially Protected Area, managed to minimize all forms of human activities to keep the area as a scientific reference site for comparison to other more disturbed parts of the ice-free region in the future. But this raises all sorts of questions about what it means to be undisturbed and who gets to decide where can be visited and where cannot. And once a place has been violated, in quotation marks, can it ever become inviolate again? A third example of the contribution of humanities and social science research relates to the ethics of going there. Should humans be in Antarctica at all? I believe that the answer to that question is probably yes, but I have a lot of respect for scholars who would take the opposite position. On one level, measuring carbon footprints and then working through the associated cost-benefit analyses can offer a useful framing for thinking about whether human activities in Antarctica can be justified. Do the scholarly or scientific benefits of visiting outweigh the environmental negatives of burning vast quantities of fossil fuels to travel to Antarctica? And this is an image taken as we were actually flying to do the reef photography work on the Asgard hut that I showed earlier. This is a question that a younger generation of researchers in the McMurdo Dry Valleys is asking with ever greater urgency. My inclination is to say that yes, on many occasions, the benefits do outweigh the costs, even if the insights that come from experience of being there is often difficult to quantify. But it is a question that needs to be asked continually by anyone conducting research in Antarctica, and the answer is not always given as yes. More profoundly, humanities and social science scholarship can also raise philosophical questions about the place of humans in Antarctica. While there is much that is attractive, for example, in keeping Antarctica, or at least large parts of Antarctica, as pristine wilderness, free from human impact, scholarship in the humanities and social sciences has also demonstrated that wilderness can be a problematic concept by, for example, perpetuating distinctions between humans and more than humans. In short, in much the same way that geographer Mike Hulme has demonstrated that many of the most pressing challenges related to climate change are in fact humanities and social science questions, the biggest challenges facing contemporary Antarctic conservation relate to subjects studied by the Antarctic humanities and social sciences. Ethical values, national identity, geopolitics, environmental perception, philosophical or theological outlooks, political power, to name just a few. But despite the importance and the relevance of humanities and social science perspectives for Antarctic conservation, I would argue that our insights are not being heard as clearly as they could be. Going there and bringing humanities and social science into dialogue with Antarctic conservation will inevitably lead to deep fundamental questions being raised. I don't think we need to be afraid of these questions, and I believe that Antarctic conservation can be stronger, more equitable, and more effective as a consequence. But at the moment, there remains a tendency to want to keep the humanities and social sciences separate from conservation debates, especially in relation to policymaking. The final few minutes of my talk this morning might be thought of as something of a manifesto, a call to arms for humanities and social sciences to get more involved with debates about Antarctic conservation and other pressing challenges facing the continent, and for the wider Antarctic community to be more open to hearing and incorporating our insights. I'm under no illusion that this will be an easy process. The initial consequence of integrating insights from humanities and social sciences will almost certainly be to confuse and complicate questions related to Antarctic conservation, and to consciously and deliberately bring politics into processes that have sought to be apolitical, or at least to appear apolitical. As demonstrated by my examples above, it is important to acknowledge that some of this work is already taking place. It has been a privilege, for example, to be involved in the SCAR and TICON group over the last few years. And from a practical perspective, I would encourage more members of the SC HAS group to get involved with that conservation-focused focus group. Humanities and social science engagement with Antarctica is not limited, of course, to the field of conservation. Humanities and social science scholars have made important contributions to the knowledge and understanding of many aspects of Antarctica, including its science, its politics, its culture, its tourism, and other forms of commercial exploitation of the continent. Many of these contributions have included some form of interdisciplinary collaboration or work with stakeholders outside academia. Other contributions might be thought of as pure humanities or pure social science research, not dissimilar to the work done by pure science in laboratories and field sites across the Antarctic continent and beyond. This work of following our own questions to wherever they may take us is useful and to be encouraged. And the flourishing of the SCAR Humanities and Social Science group shows that we are doing a really good job in growing our fields and producing our own research. But a lesson from Antarctic conservation is that humanities and social science research is not yet having the influence on wider Antarctic debates and policy discussions that it might. And as a consequence, we are missing important insights and opportunities. We need to be careful with seeking to ascribe blame for this relative lack of influence, whether onto ourselves or back or to others. But it is also important not simply to accept the way things are as an inevitable consequence of existing academic hierarchies. In other parts of the world, for example, conservation is already taking a much greater socio-ecological dimension and often proving more effective as a consequence. So why do the humanities and social sciences lack influence in Antarctica? One reason is the different historical trajectory of our fields in comparison with the sciences. As surveys of the development of our research group from Connie Ludecker on Antarctic history and from Daniela Liggett on Antarctic social sciences in recent Luanda lectures have demonstrated, it is only really in the past 2 decades that humanities and social science research in Antarctica has really taken off collectively as flourishing fields. It has been an important period of finding our feet and working out who we are and where we fit into the wider ecosystem of Antarctic research. It has been a good thing that we've had space and time to do this. In contrast, of course, the sciences have been active in and around Antarctica for well over 200 years. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty incorporated science into the political life of Antarctica in a way that is unprecedented for any region of comparable size anywhere in the world, and probably for any region full stop. The wider structures of Antarctic governance and policy making were largely designed in a continent where there was very little coordinated humanities or social science scholarship taking place at all, even as late as the 1990s when the Madrid Protocol was signed and ratified. It is easy for humanities and social science scholars to stay in our comfort zones and not to make too much of an effort to engage more widely. There is a real value in the critical perspectives we offer, and it can be most comfortable to offer these critical perspectives from a critical distance. But if criticism is always our default position, there may be less opportunity for constructive engagement. We may also absolve ourselves from the difficult task of asking about our own positionality. Where do we fit into potentially problematic power structures? The way we write and the way we present our findings are often not conducive to wider influence. Books, for example, offer us the necessary space to explore complexity and develop nuanced arguments. But books, by definition, take quite a long time to read as well as to write, and time is not often a commodity in abundance among policymakers. Additionally, some fields in the humanities and the social sciences, such as my own discipline of environmental history, have a reluctance to speculate about the future, which can be problematic in terms of policy influence when policymakers are frequently looking for insights about future directions. Evidence for structural imbalance between humanities and social sciences on one hand and the sciences on the other can be found almost wherever you look in Antarctica. We, meeting as humanities and social science scholars this week, are in fact a subgroup of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. And next year, we will meet as part of the SCAR Open Science Conference in Oslo. Again, these observations are not meant as criticism, just an acknowledgement of where we are at the moment. There is reason, as historian of Antarctic science Arndt Elzinga famously observed, that nations send scientists, not symphony orchestras, to Antarctica to make political claims. And this is not going to change suddenly. Observing the structural imbalances of Antarctic scholarship brings me full circle to where I started, and back to the question of have you been there? As a result of the dominance of science, it is much easier for aspiring scientists to travel to Antarctica to conduct fieldwork than it is for aspiring humanities and social science scholars. Given what I wrote in my original Have You Been There essay, a case could be made that this inequality doesn't matter too much. After all, as I argued, not going to Antarctica may be the best way to align ourselves with the experience of some of the most important actors we study. And as I've mentioned, since writing that essay, a powerful movement has emerged that challenges going there at all from ethical and philosophical perspectives. It may well be that Antarctica is better off without humans, And if that is the case, the decision not to go there may be the most powerful statement that the humanities and social sciences can make about the distinctiveness of our perspectives. But even acknowledging that strategic approach, based on the dominant standards of contemporary Antarctica, the decision not to go would likely be noticed a lot more widely by the wider community if a genuine possibility did exist for going. It was, as I hope I've got across during this talk, in large part through going to Antarctica and working in close proximity with scientists, but I have come to recognize what I see as the profound need for perspectives from the humanities and social sciences to be integrated more fully into Antarctic conservation. I would go as far as saying the challenges facing Antarctic environment in the 21st century cannot adequately be addressed without a fuller integration of the perspectives and insights offered by our fields. The same, I would suggest, is true of other contemporary challenges facing Antarctica. In fact, one of the most important insights we bring as humanities and social science scholars is that all of these challenges are in fact linked: geopolitical, political, social, economic, and environmental. Antarctica, like the rest of the world, is facing a 21st century polycrisis. In the face of a polycrisis, we need every possible perspective: science, humanities, social science, policy, commerce, NGOs, to be working together to understand what is happening and to find ways to move forward that promote a general flourishing of humans and more than humans alike. I would therefore encourage the humanities and social science community to see the value of our research and to get involved, to get our hands dirty through participating more fully in wider debates. I would also, perhaps more controversially, encourage us to continue to push for equal opportunities to go there, to visit Antarctica. We do not necessarily need to take up these opportunities, but simply having them will put us on a more equal footing with Antarctic science and policy communities. Greater equality in turn promotes greater mutual understanding, and this in turn will help to facilitate the diverse interdisciplinary collaborations that are needed to address the multiple and intersecting challenges facing Antarctica in the 21st century. Have you been there? Since writing that essay, I've had the tremendous privilege and wonderful experience of visiting Antarctica. But going there is about much more than just visiting the continent and ticking off another item from our bucket list of places to go. Going there is to propose a new way of doing Antarctic research in the humanities and social sciences that is fundamentally engaged, fundamentally collaborative, and fundamentally interdisciplinary. This integrative approach to research is something that the continent of Antarctica and everything living there desperately needs to address the challenges of the 21st century. These are only just the first tentative steps, and there is much further to go. Going there, in fact, means we will never arrive, but there will always be more work to do, always new places to go, both physically and metaphorically. For all the sense of pride and ambition associated with visiting Antarctica, going there is in fact an act of humility and an exercise in not knowing all the answers. Thank you very much for your time. I think there is going to be some time for questions, but a big thank you for coming today. And thank you to everyone again who has made my research in Antarctica possible.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hawkins. We will now open the floor for questions.
Adrian, there is one question from Professor Akiho Shibata. He says, thank you very much for this great lecture, and says, from your long-standing historical study of Antarctica, how do you see today's rapid expansion of new technologies such as drones, UAVs, and ice conservation geoengineering being applied or tried to be applied in Antarctica, particularly for the Antarctic conservation?
That's a really interesting question. Something we've written a little bit about in the McMurdo Dry Valleys and environmental reports that we've done on the dry valleys. I guess on the one hand, technologies like
Sí, la vamos a leer también porque hay harto tiempo.
technologies like drones offer an opportunity to do research in ways that are less impactful of the environment. You're not walking over the soils, for example. You can fly over and maybe take samples less invasively. But there's also real concern about the possibility of drones going wrong, of crashing. What happens? How do you recover them? And the sort of other technologies, the bioprospecting, for example, I think was mentioned, that do raise some really interesting legal, political, ethical, philosophical challenges for the continent. I guess in relation to my talk today, some of these technologies raise interesting questions about what that does to the act of going there and being in place and experiencing a place. In lots of ways, you can get something approaching that experience by piloting a drone into a place like the McMurdo Dry Valleys. But you're not necessarily getting the other experiences that I've talked about today, that feeling of place, the proximity to other researchers, the opportunity to engage in the collaborative research. So, I mean, these things are happening. They will shape the future of Antarctica, but they might well be another element of what I would suggest that really important to have perspectives that we offer from our humanities and social science communities into these questions, that they're not purely technical questions, but they actually change the way we understand and relate to the continent quite profoundly.
Thank you very much, Adrian. There is another question from Kevin Hughes. It says, given the imbalance in opportunity for natural and social scientists to visit Antarctica, what is the role of research funding bodies to address this imbalance? Can they be influenced?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I mean, I think that is something that we probably need to think about more carefully as a community. And if people take seriously my call today to bring in more perspectives from social sciences and humanities, because of the need for those perspectives to address the problems we're trying to address in Antarctica, the sort of the extension of that is that there should be funding and opportunities provided to scholars working in our fields to visit Antarctica and to travel there, which then puts an onus on national programs to make some more space for people from our disciplines to travel, to be embedded, to be integrated in research. I mean, I think it's important to note that some of this work is taking place, has taken place. There's been some wonderful artists and writers programs in Antarctica and different programs. My own opportunity to spend time with the Dry Valleys came from the National Science Foundation's recognition that a lot of the ecological questions that were being asked by LTR sites around the world had strong human dimensions to them, and so it was important to have some sort of human dimensions research taking place in the Dry Valleys. But I think those are also opportunities that are among the first to be cut if the budgets are tight, and that, as they often are at the moment, or in the face of a pandemic. We saw opportunities for social scientists and humanities scholars cut first. So I think it will take collective pressure to put pressure onto national programs to do this. But a lot of that has got to come from us making a case for the importance and the utility and the value of our research. So it's, I think, not lamenting that this isn't taking place, but showing why it should and why it needs to take place.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Victoria Nubiala. She says, thank you for your lecture, and asks, doesn't the ethical stance of abstaining from travel to Antarctica inadvertently perpetuate imaginaries of the continent as a pristine post-human wilderness, thus constraining deeper understandings of its social environmental realities and management challenges?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think as I was trying to suggest and didn't have a huge amount of time for that part of the talk, the idea of wilderness is problematic from some aspects, as Victoria notes there. I think the that there are ways of thinking about Antarctic wilderness, Antarctic protection, making a voluntary decision not to go, which don't necessarily need to say that that's challenging a sort of a human post-human or human more than human relationship, but actually a choice in a given context to say to ourselves, we don't need to be in this position for whatever reason that might be. So I don't think it's an inevitable consequence, but I think the way that many of these things are talked about at the moment in Antarctica are exactly as Victoria has outlined. I think the key thing really is to sort of make this a conversation, really open it up and think some of these issues through together with the people working on the ground in Antarctic conservation and environmental management.
Thank you very much. Sedenka has a comment. It said, sorry for being controversial, but I'm wondering what it says about us if we need to ensure ourselves that we are useful and we have the right to go to Antarctica.
Yep, a good question. I think that's something we should reflect on. But I think the key thing is the choice, and I think pushing for the sort of the opportunity to go, even if that is not taken up, is an important something that our fields need to be thinking about. And I think that the point, I think there is a sort of questions of equality and where we fit into this sort of wider landscape. But I would also, as I was suggesting, I think that there is, it doesn't have to be that sort of idea of pride and of sort of going there as a sort of form of conquest. Despite the photos that I put up at the beginning of myself in the brightly colored jacket, smiling at the camera. So I think there is something about the experience of being there, that actually it can be really quite humbling and counter those the sort of the hubris that maybe is seen to motivate that action. So I think that for lots of reasons there is a case to be made for pushing for more opportunities to go there. But I think the overarching point is that our fields are valuable, and that there is a need, in my opinion, for more acknowledgement of the political aspects or the philosophical aspects or the theological aspects of a lot of the policy debates that are taking place. And at the moment that is not being listened to. As I also said, I think there is a real need that we allow ourselves to do what I would call pure humanities or pure social science research about Antarctica in the way that many scientists are doing pure science research about Antarctica. And that is actually as needed, or is incredibly necessary as well. But there is, at the moment, I would say, a disconnect between what is needed from the humanities and what is actually being heard and listened to and incorporated into policy.
Thank you very much. Alejandra has one question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Adrian. This was fascinating. I couldn't write my question in the Q&A, so yeah, but I have the option to ask it directly, so even better. Yeah, so I really enjoyed the talk. As you know, I'm a bit more on the side of let's try to stay away unless we must. And I was wondering if you think that also the role of the social sciences and humanities is to say something about when scientists really need to go to Antarctica. So I wonder whether we should develop some sort of, yeah, like not a code, but maybe like a list of questions, like to make sure that when you go, you really go because you need to. So not just because of the impact in terms of CO2 emissions, but just in general, because it's such a fragile environment, and why not leave it alone? So yeah, I wonder what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree with that there are certainly things that we would bring to that conversation to help that thought process and working out when and why and how we should be visiting and doing scientific research. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things over the last, probably only the last 5 years or so, has been noting the emergence of a real sort of ground up feeling among particularly the younger generation scientists working in the dry valleys, that these questions are really important. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that it's often coming out of the science communities themselves, but without necessarily the wider context or some of the philosophical questions that might be brought into these discussions, or the historical questions that we could bring in to address that. I think a lot of research takes place because that's how it's always done. This is part of just a sort of routine of life to some degree, that you get into the habit of doing this and carry on doing it. And in fact, I think it's some of the, and I mean, again, I would say this coming out of the Dry Valley context, but this long-term continual monitoring is what gives you real opportunities to say big changes are taking place in the ecosystems of Antarctica. But maybe that doesn't necessarily need humans to be visiting those sites every year to take the measurements. There's opportunities, as Akio was mentioning earlier, with drones and with remote sensing, that we could maybe do some of the research a lot more remotely. And I think there are trends in that direction as well. But that would be a classic case that I think that we could really help out with the experience and expertise that we have as a community, groups of scientists who are trying to make those decisions about where is the best place to put our energy. If we do have to, if we're cutting down our footprint in Antarctica, where can we still use that most effectively, in terms of experiences as well as the data that comes out? So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? We still have a few minutes. We have more questions. Charn Levery says, is there a way in which focusing on not going there as an ethical standpoint misses the main route to Antarctica currently, which is the result of us all driving our cars and using air conditioning and relying on our militaries at home? The analogy could be with the way conservation humanity used to threaten whales with direct violence and now simply warms and acidifies their environment without going anywhere near them.
Yes, again, I would agree with that, and I think that's getting towards the sort of the point made by Alejandro and Peter in their paradox of protection article to some degree, although that was very much Antarctic focused. And of course, that's the sort of the counter narrative is that research in Antarctica has played a really important role, as sort of a central role in understanding climate change and understanding the global threat caused by activities taking place in other parts of the world. So that cost-benefit analysis I was talking about needs to be presented into that sort of global context where we are causing all sorts of problems everywhere. I guess that sense of sort of the poly crisis that I mentioned is a global phenomenon, and something we're talking about a lot here in the UK at the moment. And I think identifying where Antarctica fits in that is something else that we could really help with. So I think that we're not going to solve these problems either by going or by not going to Antarctica, but perhaps by integrating some more of the sort of the perspectives I'm suggesting from our fields into Antarctic science might help to model a more collaborative way of doing scholarship that we need in other parts of the world to address these multiple intersecting crises that we face. That these questions, like I said, about Mike Clum's ideas about climate change and the humanities and social science perspectives on that they are very often these are questions about identity, about values, about how we value the future. And they're not necessarily being heard as that or being presented as that. So I think there's work we can do in Antarctica that can actually inspire the multiple problems we have in other parts of the world as well. So seeing it as connected to those wider problems, I think, is key.
Thank you, Adrian. We have another question from Brian Lintott. He says, dear Adrian, excellent presentation, thank you. Could you expand upon the idea of studying spiritual views concerning Antarctic conservation?
Yes. So again, I think this has been something I've just observed through the opportunity to be spending time with colleagues from the McMurdo Dry Valley's long-term ecological research site, and many of them have been for 20 years, 25 years, and I suppose the sort of this again, it would be really important to talk to the scientists themselves to sort of see how they understand that relationship. But it is something that has become a really important part of their lives, a real connection to place that I think, yeah, at least meets that sort of dimension of the transcendent. This is a place that can sort of lift them out of the ordinary. It's a place that is a incredibly strong connection. And I would potentially argue that there's a sort of a spiritual dimension to that as well, that the transcendent merges with that as a sort of something that gives value, gives a sort of a sense that there's a kind of a higher power somewhere in there. I think the work I've done up till now in terms of religion in the history of Antarctica. So, I mean, that's another talk, perhaps for another time. But as a continent for science, I would argue that our understanding of the history of religion in Antarctica has perhaps been overlooked. But when you start to look for it, a little bit like sort of places where we can insert social science humanities questions, it starts to come up lots of different places. So one of my favorite examples of this is Admiral Byrd's book Alone, about the time he spent at the Advanced Station taking meteorological observations and being poisoned by carbon monoxide in the 1930s. But the book he wrote on that was, I would say, is very much a spiritual book, a spiritual reflection on his time in Antarctica on his own. And I think that is something that we're still seeing quite a lot of with people who are in Antarctica doing work, particularly people who go back year after year. So that would be something else I think that our community has the possibility that there's more work to be done in that area, and I think starting to be done in interesting ways.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for your presentation. It was a real honor having you today in the second day of our SCAR-HAS conference. Unfortunately, there's no more time for questions, so we're not moving on to the first block of sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Before we continue with the presentations, we would like to remind you that each speaker has 12 minutes for their presentation. When there is 1 minute remaining, we will let them know so they can wrap up. After both speakers have finished, there will be a 6-minute session for questions and answers. We kindly ask everyone to be mindful at the time, as when the session concludes, we must move on the next block. We invite you to submit your questions through the chat. If time does not allow us to address all of them, we will make sure to forward your questions to the respective speakers. Our first presentation is feedback and way forward after first workshops on establishing a Polar Archive network and proposal development of a Polar Archive action group by Maria Olivier. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Great. I'd like to share my screen, but I'm not sure. There's no way
You
that
can
I
share
can
your
share my
screen. You can share your
Okay.
screen, Maria.
Thank you. I see you made it available for me. There we go. Share. Oh, can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can see
Oh.
your screen,
Oh,
the presentation in full
okay,
screen,
thank
and
you.
hear you well, Maria.
Thank you for the opportunity at first, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning in all the areas of the world. I was very glad when Adrian Hawkins actually started, and I've actually wanted to make like little marks, Adrian, how many times you said archives and research or archives and research everywhere. And I think this is exactly what this is about, is that how important archives is and to preserve information. So many things have been discussed and so many things have been put on paper or put in a photo or somewhere. So this is a feedback of the first workshop that happened. So I'd like to proceed, and where did it all started? So in 2017 already, a lot of talks was about getting more people accepted into an archive, studying what is there, how can we put it all together. Then in 2019, again, there was a data management workshop in Argentina. In 2023, there was a panel discussions and meeting proposals as well. In 2024, there was many archive sessions at the SCAR conference. So everything kind of was set on a freezing state, or nothing happened, especially always like in 2023 in Portugal, it states, okay, I will put something forward. I will put something forward at that business meeting. I will look into it, but it never came to show. And luckily, at the beginning of this year and the end of last year, I started working towards it. So the first workshop was in March 2025, and I was actually, I can say, totally flabbergasted about it, because there was like 50 people that want to attend this workshop. I couldn't believe it. So there was a lot of people online, attending online, and there was about 20 people attending in person at the workshop. So we've worked like 2 days. It works towards the action group or towards the archival platform, or what do we want? Why are we looking at this? So there were a few key outcomes and recommendations that I quickly want to go through. And the first is access, language, and inclusion. And I think that was one of the main things. What do we include and what do we not include? And if you look at the third bullet point, that's something very important that I will get to another slide, is, are we just going to do Arctic? Is it going to be Antarctic? It's unified polar, because a lot of especially the European countries, is Arctic and Antarctic, and then many of the archives and museums, libraries, and so forth keep both collections. If we look at Scott Polar in specific, is carrying both of them. Then there's lots of things to be studied, look into in policy, ethics, and governance, and especially they promote equitable access and responsible stewardship across institutions. Obviously, standards, metadata, and interoperability will be a key factor in designing a platform or designing an archival network. Then looking at capacity building and collaboration, I think this is very important, is that when I started within the SHAS or the history working group and all that, there wasn't somebody specific looking at data management in the humanities. And since then, I've become on SCADAM in that regard. So there is a need for archives and for getting this done, keeping it out there that the rest of the SCAR community knows about it. And I think this link back also to the talk that Adrian just gave, is that where does social sciences and humanities fit in? And actually very good. So we've got to build the capacity and the collaboration to go forward. Then the infrastructure analytics and the sustainability is that securing funding models, I will come back to that, ensure centralized and equitable access through a sustainable digital platform. I think we currently have this digital conference. It seems like a way to go forward. Then timeline and future planning. And I think everything will work towards SCAR in 2026. So that's just a short of the workshop. And the conclusion was the workshop laid a strong foundation for building an inclusive, sustainable, and collaborative polar humanities archival network. By acting on the priorities and recommendations, stakeholders can ensure that the humanities and histories in polar knowledge is preserved and made accessible to future generations across disciplines, across languages, and across borders. So that comes actually short and sweet to the feedback of it. So a concept was drawn up that I will illustrate right now, and I will go to the next set. But one critical thing is that, will it be a polar archival network? Will it be an Antarctic archival network? So that is something that's got to be a decision on. And right at the last slide, I will tell you to please contact me if you want to be involved in this. Are we going to call it a network? Are we going to a platform, or are we looking just at a hub? And really differentiate between users and contributors and so more. And then obviously, and also a thing that was spoken about, funding. Funding for data management is normally very low on the priority list, and especially this is now humanities and social sciences. So it's got two of those opposites that actually attract in this case, but the funding is an issue. So the next steps, and there I've put my email address there, so please jot it down or you will get it later on, is to disseminate the feedback to all participants and relevant institutions. So that has already been done. After the archival workshop in March, the feedback that you see now and the concept platform that I will illustrate has been sent to us. So then at that stage already indicate that we've got to have follow-up meetings to maintain momentum, especially seen that we started in 2017 and only now come to really something. So we've got to keep the momentum up. So luckily now point 8 can be crossed off and checked, the presentation at SHAS 2025. At the end of October, I'm giving the same presentation at the Data Polar Forum for those that are attending in person and could not attend this and want to give feedback. And then there would be a half-day workshop at the Polar Data Forum as well. And this will discuss the things that discussions on regarding how we're going forward. So, and then especially establishing a committee for the action group. And if you think you can contribute to this, please put your name forward and let me know in this regard, that we can see and what you'd like to bring to the group. In this regard as well, Elizabeth Williams worked with me on this, and then we have person of BAS that is also here and that also indicated that he wants to be part of it. And then Ursula from New Zealand is also working since 2017 on this matter. So we'd like to establish that committee. And then one of the most important things is that we've got to put an action group proposal forward. So this has been discussed within SCADM, but also within SHAS, because with the chief officers on both sides. As I said, I'm on the committee on SCADM for humanities and social science on data management. And this has to be submitted in January 2026 to go through to the SCAR conference next year and to be discussed if an action group can be created or can be approved. All the documents in this regard has been drawn up, but as soon as we've got a committee, we will look to it and make that certain that it can go through after this next presentation and the half-day workshop. And then I've drawn up a draft roadmap. How would this platform look like? Because I always think if you see it visual, you realize what can it bring to you? Is it a possibility? Can it go forward? So I won't go in too much detail as there is not time, but as I know this is recorded, you will be able to see the slides afterwards. So as you can see there, Antarctic or Polar Archival Network, we've got to ignore the logo on the left-hand side. So that is to be, there's got to be an icon created. So what it would start off, it would show you the world map and what archives are all over the world. So I've put in there Scott Polar, a little thing, in South Africa, Antarctic legacies here. In Ireland, there's the Shackleton Museum. There is the archives in Australia. There's BAS in England. Look in Ushuaia and in Chile, that in Punta Arenas, the archives that are there. In North America, we've got a great Antarctic archive. And so that this will pop up on your first screen, that if you are logging into the platform, hub or network, whatever you call it, you will be able to see it. But it will guide you that if you click on it, you will be able to go to that archive. But if you look on the right-hand side here, we want to have a social media presence. And I think LinkedIn will be a huge attribute towards this platform, because it will tell people which people's and especially their profiles and so more. And then there will be obviously a little news article. So I've just put something randomly there. What it will tell you about what's the vision and what's the goal. So it's the preservation of the Antarctic as data, accessibility, collaboration and integration, standardization and capacity building, but it is actually to create a globally accessible and collaborative archive network that ensures the preservation. I think that's very important, and integration and dissemination. Sorry, Adrian, I'm going to again refer back to you, but everything that you've used and what you've done, so it can be taken forward as well. So that's also always very important, the dissemination, the accessibility of information. So what it will open up to you, it will show you the different continents and the different archives on the continent. I was wondering if I should put Antarctica there, as I know that at Sinai, we also have a collection of archival items and artifacts there. So I'm not sure if it will fall under South Africa or wherever. I've just put different names there. And in this regard, you will be able to go to South Africa from here. If you see above, so we've looked now at the about, it's the archives, and now we can look at members. We're still at archives. So when you go to United Kingdom, you will probably go to Scott Polar. If you click on it, the archive itself will not be on this platform. It will just direct you to that. And it seems like, but everybody would know where Scott Polar is. That's totally true. And everybody would know about British Antarctic Survey. But even for new persons that's coming along, I think it is important to highlight all the archives that are available. So going to Scott Polar, and I've just put a very short summary of what Scott Polar is and the scope and the content of the archive. And then you will go directly to Scott Polar, and you will be able to search through them. And even if you get onto the Scott Polar archives, you will probably be able to block your place to go and study and do your research. Then the other thing is the members. So you can even look in a country which members are part of the Polar, or if you know somebody, myself like Olivier, and you will press on O, then you will be able to reach it. Probably most of this will be searched by country. I've just put South Africa here. It was the easiest for me. So South Africa, it will indicate the institution that a person belongs to. It will even indicate fields of expertise. Well, I think this is very important. We're talking about capacity building. And if we want to develop other people, and especially our new early career scientists, and they've got to know, but who they're going to ask, then they will be able to see it here. There will be a search button also at on the platform that it will be able to pick up this, and then the contact details of the people. So this will be, if a member indicate it wants to be part of it, then this information will be shown. So then obviously a news one will be there. So stunning new collection arrives at Antarctica Art Gallery, older post, newer post. Yeah, I've indicated on the calendar. If you will click on there, you will see this was the HAS, that's the Polar Data Forum, that's the Polar Data Forum, that's the workshop. And then obviously going to 2026 will show you SCAR. So I think it's very important. But also what can be added here is that a new opening like this, that it's like a big event, will be part of this calendar, but all the news will be carrying here, newer and older posts. What is very important that we talked about at the workshop is that we need to have resources here. It's that we have to have a policy document, like the policy document that the data management SCAR policy will be in here. Guidelines for establishing a physical archive. You want to establish a digital repository.
Maria, you have 1 minute to finish your presentation.
Perfect. Please. And you will have your list of metadata, preserving your guidelines. All this will be available on here. The contact details will be on there. I've even made just a fake website name, and that will have to be discussed. So thank you from my side. You see what are the next steps. If you want to involve, please contact me, mail me, and we can go further. I hopefully by next year, this time we will know if the action group has been approved. We can see if we've got any funding. As you see, it won't be work specifically, and I don't think we are looking at a lot of money to spend, but the archival platform needs to be created. Depends platform, network, or hub. So there are a few decisions to be made. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to stop sharing. So if anybody got any more questions, please don't hesitate to email me or contact me. My details will be on the recording as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maria. We continue with Ignacio Javier Cardone and the presentation Hospitality and Symbolic Contestation in Antarctica, 1947-1956, a reading of welcoming performance. Welcome, Ignacio.
So, hello, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well and we can see your presentation very well.
Excellent. So, hello, thank you for having us here today. And thank you for the audience as well. I am Dr. Ignacio Cardone, professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, and with Dr. Pablo Fontana, researcher at the Argentine Antarctic Institute and the CONICET, will be presenting this work on hospitality and symbolic contestation in Antarctica from 1947 to 1956, the reading of welcoming practices. So Antarctica is usually deemed as a frozen desert, a place of extreme, or in short, a very hospitable place. Encounters with other living beings are rare, and meetings between human beings are even rarer. This makes human encounter exceptional events capable of evoking empathy and solidarity as much as they can become political performances of authority and belonging over an intimate space. While today's expression of hospitality may be interpreted by each party according to its own design, thanks to Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty, the situation was rather different before its signature in 1959 and the informal gentleman's agreement reached during the discussions surrounding the IUY Antarctic program. Particularly in the decade following the Second World War, when activities in Antarctica intensified and encounters among national expeditions became more frequent, these welcoming practices revealed the dual character of hospitality as both human and political, at once conditional and unconditional. Within this space, the dualistic power relation embedded in hospitality itself became a locus of symbolic confrontation and human solidarity. Exploring this largely overlooked dimension of interaction in Antarctica allows for a more nuanced understanding of the period's international relations, an era typically interpreted through traditional geopolitical lenses as dominated by conflict, confrontation, alliances, and balance of power. Yet a more attentive reading of these encounters can reveal how the ethos of cooperation and peaceful coexistence that later crystallized in the Antarctic Treaty was, in fact, prefigured somehow in early symbolic and performative practices. While the reader's notion of hospitality has already been mobilized within international relations, most of these engagements have centered on migration, refugees, and asylum policies. Some also examine diplomatic practices and protocol, and more recently, tourism understood as a social-political interaction fostering diplomatic relationships. Yet the concept has not been applied to explore interstate sovereignty-related actions. Conversely, conflict in the Antarctic has been predominantly read through the lens of strategic competition and performances of hostility, rather than hospitality. Histories of the dispute have tended to focus on the tensions between Argentina and Chile vis-a-vis the United Kingdom, while overlooking other forms of contestation, such as those between New Zealand and the United States, Australia and Norway, amongst others. This proposal seeks to complement these prevailing interpretations of international relations and of Antarctic disputes prior to the International Geophysical Year by advancing a perspective that highlights welcoming performances as gestures both human and political. What we offer here are preliminary reflections on the analytical framework we intend to develop in future empirical research. So going to our analytical framework, there is this notion of hospitality, well rooted in the Kantian ideal of tolerance, departs from it to become a fully developed analytical concept. Its most compelling aspect lies in how it exposes the paradox inherent in the relationship between hosts and guests. This paradox, or aporia, emerged from the tension between unconditional hospitality, understood as a welcoming of the other by virtue of their human nature alone, and conditional hospitality conceived as a political practice that asserts authority over a particular space, but is conventionally called sovereignty. The aporia also reveals the dual and reversible nature of power. The act of hosting is never purely benevolent or unilateral. It can be questioned, refused, or even inverted. The guests possess the capacity to deny their guest status, to reject hospitality, and to claim their own position as a host. In this sense, both the unconditional and conditional dimensions of hospitality coexist and constantly interact, making hospitality itself a site of contestation. Analytically, however, it is crucial to distinguish between these two registers. The unconditional aspect of hospitality pertains to the human and ethical domain, often manifested through inter-individual gestures of solidarity and assistance. The conditional aspect, by contrast, is political and performative. It materializes in actions and symbolic gestures that affirm authority or challenge the legitimacy of another's authority. Accordingly, following Derrida's concept of hospitality, we distinguish between forms of welcoming performances along these lines. Whether a performative act is enacted as part of a sovereignty claim, whether welcoming is conditioned upon the acceptance of sovereignty, whether a welcoming gesture such as offering of gift or assistance is conceived as a gracious concession of the host or an avoidable expression of human solidarity, and whether the individual or political dimensions prevails in the act of welcoming. So, going to just a few empirical examples to show how we apply this analytical framework. While welcoming and hospitality-related practices can be traced throughout the modern history of Antarctic exploration, focuses on the decade between the end of the Second World War and the International Geophysical Year, roughly 1947 and 1956, allow us to examine a period in which Antarctic activity intensified markedly. During these years, encounters between expeditions of different nationalities became more frequent, and disputes over territorial jurisdiction were more explicit and heated. This decade is often portrayed in the historiography as the most conflicted in Antarctic history, reaching its climax in the early 1950s with the Hope Bay incident of 1952 and the Deception Island incident of 1953. Yet this narrative of hostility and confrontation tends to obscure other, equally revealing interactions. An often overlooked dimension of these encounters lies in the welcoming practices that characterize interaction among parties with overlapping or conflicting claims. In this respect, hosting an ally became a symbolic act of unity, but at the same time, an implicit reaffirmation of each nation's distinct position within that alliance. Conversely, a performative practice was to welcome visiting expeditions while simultaneously protesting their arrival without prior consultation or authorization. For example, in a 1954 report from the Foreign Office, described the official form that the performative, conditional, and political act of hospitality adopt. The ambassador explained that through Her Majesty's government had only heard in a roundabout way of Admiral Olivier's plan and would of course have liked longer notice of the visit, they wished nevertheless to ensure that minister was appropriately received. Steps have accordingly been taken to ensure that all appropriate courtesies were shown to the minister during his tour of British territory and waters, and one of Her Majesty's ships had been detailed to escort the Argentine vessel. Similarly, testimonies from former members of the Falkland Island Dependency Surveys, or FIDS, reveal how this form of conditional hospitality became a routine element of interaction. This was just one more aspect of the political scene, of course. Another job for the base leader was to board any ship flying the Chilean or Argentinian flag and hand over an official protest against violation of British territorial waters. I'm glad to say this was usually accepted as routine by the captains of these ships, and most were very tolerant, which was just as well. Also, this conditional hospitality often took the form of mere tolerance, accompanied by formal protests, but it could also unfold into gestures of unconditional welcome, especially when acts of solidarity emerged in the face of shared hardship. I said, I'm required by His Majesty to deliver this letter of protest to you, handed it to him, and he read it and he said, yes, thank you. Now, he said, shall we go indoors for a drink? They sent us ashore with a lot of fresh Argentine meat, which was very good and much appreciated. So to conclude and give some final remarks, as seen, hospitality practices in Antarctica during the period studied revealed the heterogeneity that the reader's aporia of hospitality entails. The human dimensions appeared in gestures of sympathy and solidarity among individuals who faced the same extreme conditions and isolation from their home territories. At the same time, the political dimension was enacted through more or less formalized performances that sought to assert hosting authority and to tolerate or conditionally accept the presence of others within spaces deemed one's own. This overlapping expression of hospitality suggests that Antarctic encounters, rather than being purely conflictive or cooperative, often navigated an ambiguous terrain where protest and welcome, rivalry and recognition coexisted. Future research should systematically map and interpret these instances of hospitality across a broader corpus of archival material and national perspectives in order to better understand how such performative practices shape the everyday politics of prisons and encounters in Antarctica. The aim is to grasp these situated practices through which actors negotiated distance, authority, and mutual dependence in an environment that made both hostility and hospitality equally necessary. Thank you very much. I finished there.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. We will now open the floor for questions.
Isn't any question for Maria or Ignacio? We still have a few minutes if anyone wants to ask something. Okay, so I see there's no questions. Thank you very much to both of you. It's an honor having you in this conference. We are going to wait a few minutes till 10:30 to start the next block. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Maria.
All the best for everyone for the rest of the conference.
Okay, now we would like to welcome Rosario Hubert, who is going to present about the rescue extravaganza at Antarctic Gateway Cities. Welcome, Rosario.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, let me share. There you go. Can you see it properly?
Yes, we can see your presentation properly and we can hear you well, Rosario.
Perfect, thank you. So thank you very much. Thank you to Universidad de Chile for hosting this conference and gathering everybody here today. My name is Rosario Hubert. I'm Associate Professor of Language and Culture Studies at Trinity College in the US. And what I'll present today is part of a larger project on what I call Antarctic Avant-Garde, which is a project to explore the artistic and literary dimensions of the question, basically how the most extreme place on Earth is conceived in a historical moment of aesthetic innovation and experimentation. And I'll read a little bit and I'll share some examples so you'll see my face go down and up for a moment. During the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration, the ports of Buenos Aires and Punta Arenas became focal points for the coordination of recovery missions, the storage of supplies, and the dispatching of ships. Yet rescue operations were not merely logistical business, but also grand celebrations that assembled curious crowds on the docks and avid readers in the press. When the salvage ships entered the port, flotillas of decorated vessels, small boats, and tugs sailed out to meet them, to triumphant choruses of military marches and cheering multitudes. Speeches, parades, and newspapers' tributes followed for weeks. Rescue operations also produced their own Antarctic heroes. The Argentine Admiral Julián Irízar and the Chilean Navy pilot Luis Pardo are applauded to the day for having saved the lives of the crews of famous explorers like Otto Nordenskjöld from the Swedish expedition in 1903 and the very famous Ernest Shackleton from the Trans-Imperial Antarctic expedition. I call rescue extravaganza the spectacular display of patriotic pomp around the rescue operations of Antarctic shipwrecks that signaled both the maritime might of South American republics as well as their increasingly antagonistic position towards European empire in terms of territorial claims on the Antarctic territory. However, as a scholar of comparative literature, I am always interested in multilingual narratives, overlapping identities, and drifting archives. So I also understand extravaganza in its etymological sense, and thus recover the terms extra and vagari, to wander outside the beyond, and thus ask, how is the thrill of the rescue operations captured in the pages of the foreign language press of South America? And by foreign language press, I refer to the enormous number of newspapers that were printed in Chile and in Argentina in foreign languages, in English, Italian, French, German, Yiddish. In a historical period so fraught with nationalism and conflicting sovereign claims, listening to the stories of people who inhabit the borders of citizenship allows us to reconsider critical concepts in Antarctic humanities, such as distance, heroism, national territory, or hospitality, to go back to Ignacio's presentation immediately before this one. And this is a reminder how storytelling and the humanities at large can provide a mindset of international cooperation, not only in terms of future action, but also in terms of historical reconstruction. And I think echoing the gesture of Ignacio's presentation, looking at how actions occur at an individual level and a storytelling level, and not just from the perspective of policy and sovereignty narratives. So with three short examples regarding the news coverage of Shackleton's rescue in the press of Buenos Aires in 1916, and this is in the few weeks in which the Shackleton's crew crosses through Buenos Aires as a final stop before going back to England. I aim to complicate the distinction between the global, local, and foreign in the construction of an international news of this international and complicated new place of Antarctica in the geopolitical and geographic imagination of the turn of the century. And what I'll show very quickly with these examples is how the Antarctic fever surrounding the news of the rescue activates other forms of displacement in reference to war, to the market, and to the press. So when Shackleton and his men crossed through Buenos Aires, they had, just as a reminder, they're rescued by the Chilean Navy in September 1916. They arrive in Punta Arenas. They're hosted by almost every single entity in Punta Arenas. They go by train to Valparaíso, to Santiago. They take a train across the mountains and spend 4 or 5 days in Buenos Aires, in which they are very much hailed as heroes by all kinds of institutions. The Museum of Natural Sciences, the Museo de la Plata, the president, everybody holds a banquet for them. And no other group, I think, was more stirred by Shackleton's passage than the British community that saved a very special place in their itinerary. They held banquets at the Colonial Hall. The British Society gathered him. And the pages of the newspapers, The Standard and the Buenos Aires Herald, that were the main highly circulating English language newspapers, harangued their own people to go and welcome them. In a very nice note before his arrival, The Standard encouraged the readers to greet Shackleton at the train platform, reading, "Sir Ernest Shackleton and the members of the expedition accompanying him will arrive at the Retiro station of the Pacific Railway Company on Wednesday. At the international train of 7 o'clock, it is expected that all who are able will be there to give him a warm welcome." And a few days after, the same newspaper would report on how that welcome went, and how almost 400 people, members of the British community and a dozen Argentine friends, followed him from the train to the hotel a few blocks away. And the news reads, "Right at the entrance of the Hotel Plaza where the group arrived, they were followed by their enthusiastic compatriots with applause, musical affirmations of 'He's a jolly good fellow,' and impromptu renditions of 'Rule Britannia.'" And there's all this note about how people were trying to touch Shackleton, and there's a nice comment about how Shackleton was used to enduring, they make a pun with the name of the boat, of the ship, and how enduring the pressure of the crowds of people. So, and Shackleton was a celebrity by then, so there's an added element to why he was received with such a warm and heated welcome at this time. But I'm interested here in the echoes of war, in these welcome gestures, and how this is 1916, and not long before the train stations and the port of Buenos Aires had also been the stage for massive emotional farewells to Argentines with European citizenship who had chosen to enlist in the armies of the First World War. And there's a lot of research being done on the war efforts in South America, but the ethnic press and what they call the foreign language press were critical in recruiting different people from across the nation. So the pages of the newspaper at this time were absolutely flooded, not only with information of war, but with actual logistical procedures on how to enlist and promote citizens with European citizenship to register and fly and sail to Europe to fight in the war. So there's something about the ritual of the return of the soldier or the farewell of the soldier that is very much infused in Shackleton's passage through the pages of this newspaper, something that we don't see when we read mainstream news in Spanish. This is the ritual of the soldier coming from the front. And there's also an interesting take on how Shackleton's expedition had to deal with the lack of interest when he arrived back in Europe at the time, because, I mean, the priority was a war, and how he used the rhetoric of his men that had fought in the wide trenches of the South. So it's interesting how this is something that we can see in this particular narrative, in this particular media, that we don't see in other newspapers. And I also brought here an image about how it was not only recruiting a human effort to go and fight in the actual battlefields, but how the local communities were asking for financial support from its local community. And this is an ad from the newspaper The Standard, in which they ask Britons overseas to buy bonds of the English government so as to participate in the effort of war. And this is interesting because the news of Shackleton's rescue travel through different parts of the newspaper. There's some parts of it that appears in the social activities. Some parts of it appears in the international news, because this had to do with this international expedition. Part of it had to do with advertising and with this sort of call for the local community. Advertising was, by 1916, a very kind of regular place where we would see Antarctic images. The polar mania had become a very generalized thing, and I just brought two very famous examples of Shackleton posing for Burberry's, who was also the sponsor because of all the gear that he would take, but also the picture that was from the Charcot expedition that was used as an ad for the Champagne mum. And again, is it? Okay. That was used for the Champagne mum. In the case of the press of Buenos Aires, this recovery missions...
Rosario, you have
Yep.
1 minute to finish your presentation.
Oh, okay, so real quickly. Very quickly, Bovril, one of the British brands that used this meat extract that was taken by the explorers, would wallpaper almost every single newspaper, not only the English one, with endorsements from Shackleton saying how they had been fed by this massive product. Really quickly, Bovril was a meat product that had extensive land in the province of Entre Rios, where they would breed the animals that would produce this. So this Bovril product was produced in Argentina, exported to England, then taken to Antarctica in the ships, and it was promoted back when these men were back as an import product, although it was originally produced. So there's an interesting kind of back and forth element. I won't have time to discuss the last element, which was one of the most interesting one, which has to do with how the most interesting or the most accomplished pictures and photographs of Antarctica that were produced by Herbert Ponting and Frank Hurley, the first professional photographers to go on expeditions. We have photographs from early on, but none of them were so accomplished as these professional ones. And one of the things that I come to notice is that they had Hurley, which was Shackleton's expedition photographer, had a very strict contract with the Daily Sphere, the Daily Chronicle, which was the British newspaper that had very much funded the expedition. So when he prints his pictures in Punta Arenas the day after he arrives, he takes them with him in a photo album shows them around in all their stopovers, in all their banquets, but none of the photographs are printed because they were bound by contract. And one of the things that I found is that the Herald does print one. And if you can see over here, there are the marks of photographs that had not been edited. So it's this very raw image that was printed outside of the contract. I think it has to do in part with the fact that this was an English newspaper. And it ends up being the case that this ethnic press newspaper from a city in South America ends up having the scoop of what would become the most accomplished photo albums of Antarctic photography in the 20th century. And I'm going to finish here. I think I exceeded a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosario. Now we continue with Carl Walling presenting Performing an Imagined Antarctic Environment, Exploration through Admiral Byrd's South Pole Game, Little America. Welcome, Carl.
Welcome, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me and also see the screen.
Yes.
Fantastic. My name is Carl Walling. I am a lecturer of theater performance at the University of Sunshine Coast in Australia. And my presentation's title is Performing an Imagined Antarctic Environment, Exploration through Admiral Byrd's South Pole Game, Little America. During this presentation, I'll focus on the 1934 commercial board game published by Parker Brothers Incorporated and licensed by American explorer Admiral Richard E. Byrd. How does one nurture a society's shared imagination of Antarctica during the mid-20th century? In December 1933, Parker Brothers Incorporated finalized an endorsement contract leveraging Admiral Byrd's celebrity status, their gaming expertise, and increased American awareness of the southern continent and recent technological achievements into a commercial board game, Admiral Byrd's South Pole Game, Little America. Both parties sought to take financial advantage of the second Antarctic expedition, while the expedition's reports and scientific discoveries absorbed American imagination during the Great Depression. This presentation will introduce 4 topics related to the 1934 board game: its production background, gameplay mechanics, the performance element that transformed the game beyond a casual, random chance family game, and then share a brief reflection about the game itself. Why this topic? I'm interested in the multiplicity of ways that the Antarctic gets performed. Typically, this is through dramatic literature and theatrical events. And I'm also curious about the intersection between performance studies and the Antarctic. How do people associate the Antarctic beyond scientific discovery? And how do we engage our imagination about a place that most will never get to visit? Board games offer an interesting window into these questions. Using a community-based web resource, BoardGameGeek, there are 70 games currently tagged as connected to the Antarctic continent. And although some of these are expansion games to existing titles, mystery games, and penguin-related children's games, several of these games are family games, strategy games, and Euro games from a wide range of countries across the globe, and you can see several titles on this slide. As part of this presentation, I offer that performance studies provides a theoretical methodology for unpacking a board game's playing mechanics. As Richard Schechner notes, quote, performance as distinct from any of its subgenres like theater, music, dance, and the performing arts is a broad spectrum of activities, including at the very least performing arts, rituals, healing, sports, popular entertainments, and the performance of everyday life, end quote. Parker Brothers crafts a game experience enhanced by the player's Antarctic knowledge, their engagement with the expedition's radio broadcasts, and previous encounters with Byrd's various engagement activities. In the contract for this game, Parker Brothers highlights these areas of synthesis, noting in December 1st, 1933, that Byrd's expedition, quote, is for the purposes of exploration and scientific research, which will be widely advertised and of great interest to the world at large, end quote. And that Byrd, in return, will give exclusive rights both nationally and internationally to his name, likeness, and the game play itself to Parker Brothers as far as the contract is executed. Now, this was a very quick turnaround game. The game contract was finalized in December of 1933. In fact, the game contract was finalized by Admiral Byrd's agent, John McNeill, because Byrd was currently in transit to New Zealand and would arrive in Wellington a week later. Based on the correspondence, the president of Parker Brothers Incorporated, Barton, intended a quick turnaround of 3 months to manufacture this game. And in line with Bird's expedition calendar and the need for quick approvals by Bird, the contract included language on endorsement, licensing, and various game approvals that would take effect before the radio broadcasts began on the South Pole. Now, the resulting game wasn't a great commercial success, and we can conjecture about the various reasons surrounding this, where it was the game's topic, the socioeconomic audience that was targeted, or the era of publication during the Great Depression. However, we can see that there was a limited financial profit, as you can see in the slide's chart. Bird was advanced $500 for the game to endorse it, and made a little bit over $500 at $574 over the life of the first 7 years of the contract. Amazingly, the contract stayed in effect for over 12 years, and Bird finally got the cancellation notice after the Second World War in 1946. In a follow-up letter, the president of Parker Brothers noted that, well, quote, the statement was not too impressive. It might as well have been considerably worse. Games are like books, and the sale does not necessarily depend on their quality. Popularity is made up of a vast number of intangibles which are hard to determine in advance. So, why do we care about a marginally successful board game that sold over 24,000 copies largely in the United States? And I would argue that the board game provides an interesting way to get people to care about the Antarctic without the ties to science or hyper-nationalism. And as a result, what is this game? This game was a game played by 2 to 4 players. The complexity of the game lent itself towards families and younger-aged players. There was a 3-page rulebook, and it was largely a point-to-point movement map, as you can see in the image here. Today, the gameplay would be very similar to Chutes and Ladders without the morality and elements on the game board. There was no strategy to this game. And as a result, while the game may have been replayable at younger ages, it's easy to see how the game would wear out quickly for older audiences. The game provides some unfair mechanics, such as getting stuck in endless movement loops. And while there were popular culture environment elements connected to Bird's anticipated flights on the second expedition, and particularly his flight in 1929 in his first expedition to the South Pole, there were very few historical markers on this particular game. However, I would argue that the game's replayability was reliant on a player's engagement with the present expedition through radio. And in order to play this game, players need to both learn the gameplay mechanics alongside the rules of a performance as part of the rulebook. Now, there was one element that transformed the game, and this was the handheld microphone that was included with the game. Now, this was a spinner device. It was numbered 1 through 6 and facilitated movement instead of a 6-sided die. And while incorporating a spinner device was not innovative for a board game, the dual usage of the spinners was fascinating. Each player's spinner resembled an early 1930s microphone. The microphones were literally plugged into the wooden playing surface through designated holes in order to, quote, connect the player with all other stations. There were instructions on how to hold the microphone and instructions on how to announce the various gameplay developments during the course of the game, including how to hold the microphone an exact distance away from the player, quote, just like a radio announcer. And so throughout the rulebook, players were repeatedly told to imagine the Antarctic through these creative broadcasts. Of the rulebook's 21 paragraphs, 8 of them involve using a microphone as a performance device to facilitate gameplay. Notably, these broadcasts, or these fictionalized broadcasts, fell into 3 distinct categories: misadventure, establishing performance, and public relations. The first of these was establishing the performance rules, and this was done through the Little America space on the board. This was the first radio space in the game, and everyone was required to stop there. It was also the first performative space on the map. It required players to share their Antarctic journey so far as they traveled from sea from New Zealand to the southern continent. Additionally, through the rulebook, players were encouraged to share information about camp conditions, the meals they ate, the Antarctic experiences so far, as well as the weather. The second category was misadventure zones, and these could be encountered multiple times during the game. There was literally call for help spaces that were quite harsh because you were stuck at that space until you called for help and another player would facilitate your escape condition, which was often a 50-50 guess. And then finally, there were, for lack of better words, public relations spaces. And this was the Penguin Village that was indicated on the map, which you can see in this slide, as well as Bird's Flight. Now, while both of these were missable events, the Penguin Village was much more likely to be encountered. And there were rules about this in terms of how you imagine your broadcast as you imagine seeing the penguins nearby and describing them to other players. These imaginations were certainly possible through a variety of sources: books, film, photographs, etc., surrounding Bird's expeditions. However, there's a clear intent to tie the player's knowledge to Bird's upcoming radio broadcasts. The concluding paragraph in the rulebook highlights the synergy between Parker Brothers Incorporated and Bird's second expedition, as the game asks prospective players to, quote, invite your friends to play Little America and to enjoy the broadcast with the folks at home, unquote. Through these game elements, the game's publisher actively pushes for players to ground their creative contributions towards gameplay through research. It goes to reason that if a player is highly informed by these broadcasts, they will have a more enjoyable time playing the game, because they will have a more complete world building and more complete interactive discussions with other players. This can create a shared collective imagination of the Antarctic continent, one that can be more complex with additional information gleaned from Bird's expedition. The game structures a player's continued connection to the continent through gameplay over the span of the expedition's activities by outlining key obstacles, weather in transit, as well as key successes, the flight over the South Pole, and animal encounters. It highlights the changing times of the mid-20th century America, one where print news is being supplemented by growing dominance of radio, photography, and the early days of film. If the game is replayed, the game not only solidifies a non-scientist's knowledge of Antarctica through creative play and performance, but it also gets them to imagine the possibilities as an active participant through gameplay. What if you were there? Will your imagined experience become realized? And through performance dice, we can unpack the educational transformation of knowledge through performance alongside the formation of a shared community vision, even if it's at a highly localized level, such as a neighborhood or family unit. In wrapping up this presentation, I wanted to highlight another aspect of the game, kind of the 21st century reflection of the game itself. And as you can see, these are maps from Bird's first and second expeditions to the Antarctic, and both recognized a very limited geographic scope for the expedition's travel. Now, when we go and look at these maps and then review the game map again, we can see some ahistorical details that might be contaminating a player's imagination, mixed in with some historical results. Such as the expedition's radio broadcast pathway, Buenos Aires to New York, is faithfully represented. Similarly, there's a partial representation of the stopover in New Zealand, although Bird would change his location from Dunedin to Wellington for one of his ships during the course of the journey, which wouldn't have been captured by the game since it was going into publication at the same time. Even Parker Brothers headquarters in Salem, Massachusetts is highlighted on the map. You may notice that the Antarctic Peninsula is missing from this map. However, this is not shocking, given that Rye Mills' expedition confirming geography of the Antarctic Peninsula was in 1934-1937, which was right after this game went to print. However, what is interesting about this, and what causes a little bit of consideration in the 21st century, is that once you've moved beyond Bird's Little America space on the game map, the geopolitical implications are astonishing. Bird's flight is coming from two ahistorical directions towards the South Pole. The map allows players to sled around the entire circumference of the Antarctic continent. And while certainly a geopolitical goal was to map the Antarctic continent from the air, there's a secondary non-aerial path to the South Pole of sledding towards it, which would have been completely ahistorical for Bird's expedition. All of these corrupt the player's understanding of Bird's accomplishments.
Carl,
and arguably
you have 1 minute
Yes.
to finish your presentation.
Oh, fantastic. All of these corrupt the player's understandings of Bird's accomplishments and arguably distort the comprehension of exploration of the South Pole. In essence, the game not only reinforces imagination and creativity, your connections to the Antarctic through play, but also reinforces things that are fictionalized that will cause contamination and shape and influence your perceptions of the Antarctic well after the game is done. And thank you very much for listening. Here are some works referenced, and special thanks to Ohio State University's Center Archives for providing several of the images as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Carl and Rosario. We'll now move on to the next part of the session in virtue of time. Okay. We now hear from Edith Weeks, who will speak on Taboo to speak about colonization and development in Antarctica, the art of bulletproofing an international treaty regime. Welcome, Edith.
This is a multidisciplinary critical legal theory lens to analyze the international regimes that are governing the new frontiers. And for me, that includes outer space, the Arctic, and more recently, Antarctica. So I've been studying and comparing the legal regimes across these three areas. My core argument today is that we can and we must bulletproof the ATS treaty system. But the only way to do this is first we have to dismantle the profound ideological barrier that paradoxically encourages colonization. The success of the ATS system in the past in staving off conflict over territorial claims is no guarantee that geopolitical conflict, inequality, or environmental devastation will be prevented forever. No treaty can do that. So that's what I would like to discuss today, some ideas that I've been nurturing. One of the speakers yesterday used that term. I really like that term. So we are at a critical juncture, and I'm going to provide a proactive critique and talk about ideological lockdown. We've all been socially conditioned to see Antarctica as something way out there, something crazy to think about, something just for a few. But this is the very thing that will ultimately cause Antarctica to wind up, like so many other territories, only becoming for significant benefit of a handful of key actors. The fundamental challenge is that most people in the world view international law and international law's failures as a puzzling systemic glitch, rather than a predictable outcome of entrenched interests. Crucially, we have a powerful arsenal of intellectual contributions, and they were created to critique historical wrongs from the past. For example, post-colonial theory, critical legal theory. I'm suggesting we apply those theories that are gathering dust in so many libraries to foresee and prevent future repeating patterns and problems. These are our powerful, proven tools for understanding how domination and exploitation have been executed in the past. And oddly enough, it's taboo for us to speak about these things. I've learned that the hard way. When I do speak of Antarctica and colonization, I'm often told, oh, you can't say colonization for Antarctica. It's too early to call it colonization. Yet, as I understand it, data shows there were approximately 100,000 tourists in the region last year. There are trucks and airplanes and helicopters and ships and flights in and out, and approximately 70 buildings. Oh no, those are just research bases. Oh no, those are just a basis. Okay, for me, using a lens of international relations and critical theory, those are the seeds of colonization. I refuse to wait until yet again it's too late to speak of colonization or scrambles. And so I'm doing so regarding Antarctica. We're usually told, oh, wait until a problem actually manifests. But why is that? Why do we always have to wait? Wait until it's too late? I implore you, we must decide to refuse to wait until full-blown conflict to expose that pre-colonization processes are currently underway. To bulletproof the ATS system, we must understand the core contradiction. We have so many international laws that promise peace, world peace, equality, justice, environmental sustainability. The nations of the world and the people within those nations have agreed and signed so many agreements, yet these things continue to elude us. Critical theory can explain to you exactly why that is and how that continues to be the case. Political realities are often shaped by domination, irrespective of the beautiful hopes and dreams and the beautiful words written in our treaties, declarations, protocols, resolutions, and contracts. We can use, for example, as one example of an intellectual contribution, the Gramscian method to understand how power operates through manufactured consent. Of course, that's Noam Chomsky's term, manufactured consent. But I dovetail and connect that with Gramsci. He provides a lens through which we can look at certain indicators for the subtle, hidden micro dynamics and factors that ultimately tend to become exercises of power over territory, water resources, land, natural resources, transit routes, making powerful interests seem universal rather than key actors taking actions. We can examine that. There's evidence that we are in the pre-colonization phase of Antarctica. The long-term massive human presence and investment. I was in a conference in Punta Arenas, Chile in August of this year, and lecture after lecture, so many scientists are down there with machines and they have video clips riding boats and trucks and living in structures. And for me, that's the beginning of colonization. So human presence, investment, both private and public investment, permanent buildings, infrastructure that requires huge logistical support, daily flights, ships, modern amenities, refrigerators, big screen TVs, stoves, and the tourists again. This is a significant footprint, the groundwork for potential disputes. Now, I know you may be thinking, oh, well, the Antarctic Treaty took care of that. Well, treaties can only do so much for so long. So the Antarctic Treaty actually put those territorial claims on hold. And many scholars are very concerned about this. And then there's climate change. Scientists consistently tell us that the ice is melting faster than predicted. And the Madrid Protocol, as I understand, is up for review in 2048. That's coming up pretty soon. So these are potential dynamics that cause the treaty to be under threat in this pre-scramble phase, as I call it. Evidence of plastic pollution, I heard about that yesterday, and other non-compliance issues and concerns of the various scholars presenting at this conference. We have laws, we have rules, we have documents, but these things are occurring already. In addition, the backdrop of all of this is the customary disregard for international law. Stephen J. Hoffman et al. 2022 inform us that they analyzed approximately 250 international treaties, and they say that all have failed to achieve their intended effects. And for me and for Hoffman et al., this represents a profound systemic failure. Power's true agenda often reveals that international law tends to be used in the service of power. Law and politics are deeply interconnected, and the law is consistently subordinated to the interests of dominant states individuals, and corporations. Compliance with the ATS system is determined by perceived national interest, not just formal obligations. This confirms why the temporary hold on claims and the 2048 review are so dangerous. The law is constantly at risk of being ignored. But there's hope. Already we see signs in the Arctic legal regime and the outer space legal regime of attempts to marginalize commons provisions. We must take proactive stances. For example, we can proactively do a historical analysis to prevent the ATS system from adopting the same pattern of dispossession and disregard for the treaty's spirit. I've created a legal ultrasound that allows us to do a blend between critical international relations theory analysis and critical legal theory analysis. We can scrutinize the underlying bases of legal frameworks, questioning the neutrality of the ATS system. We can uncover subjugated knowledge. Some disciplines, some fields, for example, international relations, critical theory, have been subjugated so that people who study these disciplines are often disregarded. Science, the scientists, they're the ones who get funded. They're the ones whose trips get financed, etc. And that creates a domineering structure whereby these critical voices are often silenced or left in the heads of particular scholars, such as myself. Discourse analysis. We can analyze the language and the narratives used and expose how ideology, for example, the ideology, oh, this is pure science. Yes, there's military infrastructure down there, but it's purely for science. These bases, oh, it's not colonization. The bases are purely for science and research. So as to comply with the treaty while at the same time maintaining a strategic, economic, political, or even military foothold is possible. In conclusion, the concrete actions are as follows: neutralize strategic assets, mandate that the commons principles be respected and not stepped over, especially once the ICE acceleration opens access to precious natural resources, transit routes, etc. Adopt Earth's jurisprudence and the rights of nature, respect those rights, and strengthen the enforcement and inclusion to combat non-compliance and to disrupt this idea that it's taboo to speak. The international community cannot afford to allow a few states to dominate world politics any longer. It leads to instability and failure of global cooperation and the lack of our fulfillment of the many treaties and agreements that the world wants. The future of Antarctica is a test for us. Are we willing to proactively critique and challenge this taboo? Let's expose the nexus between law and power and implement
1 minute to finish your presentation,
safeguards. We do not have to wait for historical problems to repeat. We can, through transformative governance, bulletproof the ATS treaty. Thank you very much for your attention. I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Edith. Now we continue with Melissa Salerno and Maria Jimena Cruz with the presentation Recognizing Sealing Landscapes as Industrial Heritage, a call for inclusive narratives in Antarctica. Welcome, Melissa and Maria Jimena.
Well, hello to everyone. I think I'm now sharing my presentation correctly. Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for being there. This presentation is a collaborative work by Jimena Cruz, Andrés Aranquín, and myself. And today, Jimena and I will be presenting it. We are from CONICET, Argentina, and from the Federal Universities of Minas Gerais and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The title of the presentation is Recognizing Sealand Landscapes as Industrial Heritage. Well, Antarctica was the last major region to be drawn into the modern world. Its remoteness, extreme conditions, and lack of indigenous populations gave it a distinctive trajectory, yet from the outset, it was connected to global processes such as capitalism, imperialism, and others. According to accepted accounts, the South Shetland Islands were the first part of Antarctica to be sighted and landed upon in 1819. Soon after, sealing vessels began exploiting fur and elephant seals. For more than a century, this activity dominated human presence in the region and drove seal populations to the brink of local extinction. Despite its role in early Antarctic history, sealing remains largely absent from heritage narratives. This presentation explores why sealing has been marginalized as a form of industrial heritage and proposes a landscape perspective that integrates archaeological and documentary evidence to better understand its dynamics. Finally, it reflects on how sealing landscapes might be more fully integrated into Antarctic heritage frameworks. As you know, Antarctica is governed through the Antarctic Treaty System. Within this framework, heritage protection falls under the Environmental Protocol. Annex 5 established the list of historic sites and monuments as the main instrument for safeguarding historic values. Most recognized sites and monuments date from the heroic age of exploration or later moments and highlight activities celebrated by the treaty itself, like geographic exploration, science, and conservation. Industrial activity, however, occupies a more uncertain place, often linked to capitalism and environmental degradation. Of the 96 sites and monuments currently listed, only 7 relate to sealing and whaling. The 5 monuments commemorate exploration events, even though these occurred within broader productive contexts. By contrast, the 2 sites, a sealing-era shipwreck on Elephant Island and Whalers Bay on Deception Island, explicitly reference sealing and whaling as wide-ranging activities in the region, yet their narratives differ. The shipwreck's designation emphasizes navigation risks, overlooking broader industrial dynamics, while Whalers Bay represents a more complete story of whaling as an industrial enterprise. Its material remains reveal both the industrial logic of oil rendering and the organization of daily life in isolation. The success in building a coherent narrative for Whalers Bay may reflect several factors, but one crucial element from our perspective is that the site fits comfortably within conventional ideas of industrial heritage, including site-based production, mechanization, and monumentality. Meanwhile, other forms of production, such as sealing, though equally tied to capitalism and representing the largest number of sites in Antarctica, still fall below the threshold for fuller recognition. Here it is useful to look briefly at what we already know about sealing and what we still need to learn. During each summer, vessels sent small gangs to many beaches, setting up temporary camps that lasted from a few days to months. Most were never reoccupied, unlike Whalers Bay, where several activities took place in one location. Sealing sites were dispersed. Most camps were simple, low stone structures covered with skins or tarpaulins, or makeshift shelters built in caves or under overturned boats. Their traces are subtle, often invisible to the untrained eye. The objects left behind were equally modest: food remains, pipes, fragments of clothing, production tools, were less discarded. Sealing relied on simple manual methods that didn't depend on mechanization. Archaeologists have often studied sealing camps as isolated units, focusing on subsistence rather than production. This has created a simplified view of the industry, one that sees camps as self-contained spaces where all tasks from hunting to processing occurred. Yet this perspective overlooks what truly defines sealing, its distributed nature and diversity. To challenge this, we first need to rethink what we mean by industry and look beyond a science-based perspective. Traditionally, industry was linked to mechanized production. Today, it is understood more broadly as organized and sustained production, whether or not it relied on machines. This view includes what was once called proto-industrial activities that developed before and alongside the Industrial Revolution, profit-driven, market-oriented, and globally connected systems that dispersed work across multiple locations, much like sealing. Recent work in industrial archaeology and heritage studies has emphasized landscape approaches. Following scholars such as Ingold and others, landscapes are not static scenery, but dynamic assemblages shaped through practice, experience, and memory. And the related notion of taskscape helped us understand how interconnected activities unfold through time and space structured by places and mobilities. Jimena?
As part of the international project Landscapes in White, we build on Barr and Pearson's idea of cultural landscapes, extending it by framing sealing as an industrial landscape. Our approach combines documentary and archaeological evidence. From the documentary side, we are analyzing a large set of unpublished logbooks that record landings, movement, and productive tasks, while noting the geography and resources more relevant to sealing crews. The notion of sealing strategies is central here, showing where gangs were deployed, for how long, and with what aims. This helps us anticipate their traces and interpret sites as a part of a wider system. Archaeologically, more than 50 sites have been identified in the South Shetlands, with Byers Peninsula and Elephant Point showing the highest concentration. Within this new framework, we are re-examining these locations to understand their role within broader sealing strategies, the types of exploitation carried out, the operational stages represented, and their connection to other places. We are also expanding fieldwork into poorly surveyed and unexplored areas of the islands. This broader view highlights the need to consider not only camps, but also other kinds of locations. Whenever possible, we link historical documented places with their archaeological counterparts, testing expectations about the material footprint of sealing strategies and refining or challenging interpretations. Next slide, please. A full account of our ongoing research lies beyond the scope of this presentation, but we would like to share a few examples that illustrate how sealing operated at a landscape scale. One particular revealing source is the logbook of the American vessel Huron, commanded by Sean Davis. During the first two voyages to the South Shetlands in 1820 and 1821, the Huron anchored at Yankee Harbor on Greenwich Island, a safe and strategic mooring. From there, gangs operated at different ranches, some nearby for days, others farther afield for weeks. On the first voyage, most distant groups stay along Livingston Island's south beaches. On the second, activity spread across the island with clear specializations. Fur seals at Cape Sheriff, elephant seals at Johnson's Dock, and both species on the south beaches. A shallop connected these camps to the main vessel. Processing was also distributed. Skins salted on board, while blubber was boiled in tribors at Yankee Harbor. A closer read of the Huron's logbook, however, suggests that the camps along Livingston Island's south beaches may correspond to archaeological sites spread across several kilometers. Earlier studies focused on links among sites with short beach sections, but the documentary evidence points to much broader networks. Playa Sur or Punta X, Sealer Hills or Viator Points, and even sites at Elephant Point might all have been established by the same crew, possibly connected to the mooring at Yankee Harbor. We once assumed that most camps were functionally similar, but current research revealed traces of different types of exploitation. Sealer 3, for instance, showed evidence of fur sealing with a small structure containing a pile of skins apparently left for later collection. By contrast, Cutler 1 on the north beach of Bayer Peninsula showed clear evidence of elephant sealing, including seal lances, casque fragments, and burned sediments from tripods. Archaeological evidence also confirms that the full operational chain was not always completed at kill sites. Many fur sealing camps lacked suitable drying conditions or enough salt. Wooden stakes at Sealer 3 suggest drying took place there, but none were found at Playa Sur 1. Elephant sealing required triwards for oil rendering, but since heavy equipment was difficult to transport, this stage was usually centralized. Beyond the camps, the sealing landscapes also encompass moorings, wrecks, survivor camps, and the meaning and knowledge that sealers attach to the region. Altogether, these elements reveal a coordinated system operated across multiple locations, an industrial landscape where places function as nodes in a wider network of activity, and mobility was not merely movement, but a key part of placemaking itself. So what does all this mean for Antarctic heritage? Heritage narratives are never neutral. They select and organize evidence, shaping how we remember the past. In Antarctica, industrial heritage has long remained on the margins, and when it is recognized, as in the case of the whaling remains at Desolation Island, the story often reflects nationalist agendas and traditional ideas of industrial heritage. If we acknowledge the broad reach of sealing in the South Shetlands, its networks, material traces, and intangible dimensions, heritage policy could move toward a more inclusive and representative understanding of Antarctica's past, one that reveals the diverse form of industrial activity in the region, the connections to global capitalism, and the participation of anonymous workforce. The UNESCO World Heritage List already recognized cultural landscape as the result
You have 1 minute to finish your presentation.
Okay, of long-term interactions between people and environments, extending beyond individual sites to wider territories. Within the Antarctic 3D system, existing tools could be reoriented around the idea of sealing landscapes. Current protections focus on bounded areas, producing fragmented narratives where each HSM or ASPA stands in isolation. A landscape approach will allow a more integrated vision, moving from discrete places to interconnected systems. Over time, this could lead to a recognition of the South Shetland as an industrial sealing landscape within the 3D system, but this will require sustaining research, political will, and above all, broader acknowledgement of sealing as part of Antarctic industrial heritage. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melissa and Maria Jimena. We will now open the floor for questions.
Is there any question? We have a few minutes for one question. No, I didn't see any question. Okay, so thank you very much, Edith, Melissa, and Maria Jimena. It was an honor. Your presentations were very good and excellent. We will wait a few minutes till 11:30 for the next block. Thank you very much.
Okay, we continue van der Vat with the presentation, Decay as a Geopolitical Agent in Antarctic Heritage. Welcome, Katy and Liz Mary.
Okay, can I, my video is disabled.
Katy, are you there?
I am speaking, but my video is disabled for some reason. So you would need to enable that for me to be able to speak. My video is still disabled, but I guess you see my slide.
We can see your slide. We are working on your video.
All right, but I can nevertheless start. My face is not that important. You will be looking at the slides anyway. Okay, here it should come. All right, so we're going to talk about heritage and decay as a geopolitical agent in Antarctic heritage. And we will not be able to cover all of that we've been thinking in the 12 minutes we've got, but we'll share some thoughts and throw them in the air. And I will start with my absolute favorite cartoon from Antarctica that I will show every time when I talk about historic sites and monuments. This is from one of the ECHO newsletters that was published in the 1980s at the occasion of each ATCM by a coalition of environmental NGOs. And here they are being very critical about the remains of human activities on Antarctica, and they rhetorically asking, saying that there can be no denying that the Antarctic environment has suffered by the presence of UK bases. And when, for example, are the abandoned bases B, G, and N on the Antarctic Peninsula going to be removed, or are they about to be declared historic monuments? And the Penguin then says, well, if this is a monument, then I will leave my potentially historic guano on the feet of the ADCPs in Paris. And lo and behold, they probably need to do what they promised, because one of the bases, well, the bases G and E have not been nominated as HSMs yet, the historic sites and monuments. The base B is actually part of a nomination in Whalers Bay that we just heard about. So it was nominated as HSM 71 in 1995, but to be true, also after cleanup activities by BAS in 1990 and 1992. And this spectacular ruin is one of the 20 most visited sites in Antarctica. And it's clear that for tourists, the remoteness and decay in a very picturesque coastline setting really enhances the site heritage value, and it allows for a reenactment of some explorer past. But we can also see that it really draws attention worldwide, and sometimes also a non-welcome attention, as in the shape of this graffiti. So this leads us to the question, so how do we really understand decay in heritage? So what about decay that is so interesting for people to look at or in the heritage process? And decay is essentially a process of slowly breaking down materially or chemically an object or whatever that will eventually destroy the object or transform it into a new state of matter. So it is a destructive decomposition. So what was will not be at some point. And it's easy to understand the dual role decay plays in absolutely all heritage, not just Antarctic heritage, when we look at some very famous, say, non-Antarctic sites like Acropolis. So it has a very dual role. On one hand, it is a threat to the integrity and existence of the object. It is if the decay continues, the object will no longer be. But at the same time, it is a prerequisite of heritage protection. We never protect objects that are fully vital and are not in danger. So therefore, decay must be present for an object to be understood as heritage sites to be protected. And at the same time, the signs of material decomposition are really a proof of authenticity and age. They are the certificate of a passage of time. They are really important for the object to be considered authentic. So if we see a historical heritage object with no signs of decay, we will consider this most probably a fake or a replica, or are as a bad example of conservation. So all heritage lives in a constant state of arrested decay, where the decay is being managed, it's curated, it's displayed, but it's also fair. So you stop it and maintain it at the same time. In Antarctica, decay is a very ontological characteristic of a heritage. It's because all of the objects that we have in Antarctica, the Antarctic heritage as a whole, it consists of single-use objects. They were intended to be discarded as the expedition progressed or concluded. That means they were never meant to last. So this is like a huge difference with many of the spectacular architectural heritage sites in continental world, where that were meant to stay forever, for generations. Antarctic heritage objects are in a natural state of decay. They were left to degrade over time. They were never meant to persist. And Antarctic, the decay is obviously particularly salient or acute in Antarctica, but because of the special conditions. Again, these conditions are dual. On one hand, the objects are very fragile and the environment is really harsh. So it makes arresting decay from wind erosion, melting waters, etc., very challenging. At the same time, the decay is suspended biophysically due to the lack of microorganisms on this continent. It's waiting to happen. It's waiting to decay as soon as the climate change kicks in. So the fungi wait there to start growing again as the climate warms. So these objects are in a particular state of arrested decay. And because, yeah, we'll go there. And this really sparks debates about how explorer huts should be restored. Some advocate for natural dilapidation. So, you know, these are sites some were meant to dilapidate, just let them be, let the wind do the work. However, common managemental practice often involves restoring objects to the previous states, leaving them in a state of suspended decay. And in some of the cases, we have seen debates of whether we have restored the objects into too good of a state. It's because Antarctic objects, they are meant to be decayed. This is a sign of the authenticity in that landscape. So if you restore the objects too well, they become, that infringes on the authenticity of the material. And erases, the more important thing, that it also has a geopolitical dimension. So the geopolitical reality of a frozen territorial plains really makes the decay of the heritage sites doubly important. The presence of decayed artifacts and the careful curation are really crucial for demonstrating the political legitimacy of the states that manage them. So the decay, the objects that are there and they are left to decay, they show the duration of time since the first heroical act of being there, but also show the acts of what we can call effective occupation or management, the acts of intervention, the acts of care over time. So it gives some political legitimacy and time. If you then address the decay and renovate too well, you also delete other parties' management actions. And this is one of the reasons why the geopolitical dimension of a decay and of these objects is one of the reasons why in Antarctica we have on-site conservation. So you're not supposed to remove the objects. On-site conservation in these conditions is really challenging. There's limited tools. You can bring stuff only once a year. And it often can actually lead to worse material deterioration than you would have if you would take the objects with you and conserve them in right lab environment. But so it prevents complete destruction, but at the same time, under the current institutional framework, conserving the actual material remains in Antarctica is secondary to conserving the political system. Also, often besides, it's very costly, but it's a geopolitical compromise. And often the work on the ground has to be carried out by people who are not trained in heritage conservation. So their understanding of authenticity, material integrity, decay, how to handle the material is very different from heritage or museum specialists. And some of the work can also interfere with the material integrity of the objects. At the same time, well, this is the geopolitical situation that triggers that. One of the examples here could be the hut, Swedish hut at Hope Bay. Nice state of orchestrated ruin where we can see different layers of care and management. So the structures that were supposed at some point to protect the monument are currently also at the same time threatening its integrity. The metal structure is pulling the walls down. The repairs are not marked anymore, and therefore they're also threatening, so to say, authenticity. But at the same time, erasing the marks of these generations of care is unthinkable from a geopolitical perspective. And lastly, decay is really the agent that lets us see the ethics of care in Antarctic heritage. So this is not so different from the ethics of care that we see in other contexts, including indigenous contexts. That is, that all tangible heritage sites are accompanied by intangible heritage values, the values of so what is important for many of the people that work there is not just the materials state of these things, but also the act of care. And while for heritage specialists, I'm finishing now, the heritage specialists, their actions, say, for example, cooking in the kitchen of a Nordenskiöld's house are clearly a violation of the material integrity of the sites. For the people who've been doing that, the original use of the kitchen is more important and more valuable. And they consider museification of these heritage sites as a loss and decay of a cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katy. And closing out this session is Ileana Rodriguez with the presentation Linguistic Equity in Latin America Antarctic Involvement. Welcome, Ileana.
Thank you, Diego. Let me try to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my presentation.
Yes.
Fabulous. So thanks to everyone for being here and interested in these topics. I'm going to be talking about linguistic equity in Latin America's Antarctic engagement. Let me start with a simple fact that most of you probably all know, which is the fact that the Antarctic Treaty is officially quadrilingual. English, French, Spanish, and Russian are all recognized as equally authentic languages. But in practice, as we also know, English dominates almost everything. That's documents, meetings, scientific discussions. And this gap between principle and practice creates a hidden barrier, one that limits participation, particularly for Latin American countries. What I want to show today is that language is not a minor technical detail. It is central to equity, representation, and influence in Antarctic governance. We often hear about equality, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, as a framework for creating fairer institutions. But within EDI, language has often been overlooked. Linguistic equity is not the same as multilingualism. Multilingualism means simply recognizing the fact that there are multiple languages in a given territory, or in this case, within a governmental framework. And linguistic equity, on the other hand, means ensuring that everyone, regardless of their native language, has equal access to information, to participation, and to decision-making. Without that equity, multilingualism can actually reinforce hierarchies rather than dismantle them. And in governance frameworks like the Antarctic Treaty System, language is power. It decides whose voice is heard and whose voices gets lost. As most of you know, the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959 and came into force a couple of years later. It designated Antarctica as the region for peace and science, and it established the 4 languages we've already mentioned. So on paper, there is linguistic equality to some extent, but in practice, English has become the de facto working language of the ATS. This is not surprising. It mirrors the global dominance of English in science and in many other environments and industries, but it has consequences. Non-native speakers face extra hurdles: slow access to documents, reliance on translations, and reduced influence in negotiations. And for LATAM nations, this dynamic is significant too. Latin America's Antarctic presence is diverse. Argentina and Chile were originally signatories of the treaty. They secured Spanish as one of the legal languages, which gave them an important foothold. As someone from Uruguay, as a Latin American, we have to acknowledge that we're grateful to Argentina and Chile for that. Brazil, however, joined later in 1975 and as a consultative party only in 1983. By then, the linguistic framework was, of course, already well set, and Portuguese was excluded. One could argue that this shaped Brazil's trajectory in Antarctic governance, but that's for another presentation. Other Latin American countries like Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay participate as well. And more recently, non-consultative parties like Colombia and Venezuela have joined. The key point is this: the region does not have a unified linguistic presence. Let's look at 2 concrete cases of Latin America now. First, there's RAPAL, the meeting of administrators of Latin American Antarctic programs. Created in 1990, it includes all the aforementioned countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay. And in RAPAL, Spanish is the default working language. Reports are written in such language. Discussions happen in Spanish too. This reinforces regional collaboration, but it also marginalizes Portuguese. Brazil, despite being one of the largest contributors, lacks recognition for its own language. Now, let's contrast this with the case of PROANTAR, that is Brazil's national Antarctic program. PROANTAR operates entirely in Portuguese. Its official documents, the Normas Padrão de Ação, are monolingual. This asserts national identity, but it creates barriers for others to access Brazil's contributions. So what do we see here? We see Spanish dominating at the regional level and English dominating at the ATS level, while Portuguese remains to some extent isolated. The result is fragmentation, not unity. To study this, I looked at ATS's documents too, like RAPAL records and PROANTAR regulations. In the ATS, English dominates overwhelmingly. From 1959 to 2024, English appears consistently across all decades. Spanish, French, and Russian appear, but less often, and sometimes inconsistently. In fact, 11 official ATS reports were published only in English, and in RAPAL, Spanish is the default. Reports are written in Spanish, and only unofficial translations are sent to international bodies. In PROANTAR, Portuguese seems to be exclusive. Its operational guidelines are monolingual. Taken together, these findings reveal entrenched linguistic hierarchies. On paper, the ATS is multilingual, quadrilingual more precisely, but in practice, it reproduces inequalities. It's basically monolingual. Now, why should we care about these hierarchies? Well, basically because language is not neutral. Language shapes identity, visibility, and influence. When English dominates, it favors native speakers or those with high proficiency. When Spanish dominates regionally, Portuguese is marginalized. This limits Latin America's collective voice. Instead of presenting a united front, the region appears fragmented, and that weakens its position within the broader Antarctic governance system. So the issue is not simply about translation, it is about equity, representation, and power. Now, it's worth mentioning that there are initiatives addressing diversity and inclusion in Antarctic science. In 2019, the United Kingdom launched a Diversity in Polar Science initiative. SCAR established an EDI action group in 2021, and COMNAP has recently begun projects to promote inclusivity in Antarctic operations. But in all of these, language tends to be treated as secondary. They focus on gender, race, or harassment prevention, very important topics, of course, but the linguistic dimension is still underdeveloped. That gap is precisely where my work intends to intervene. So what can be done? Well, first, strategic multilingualism. Make sure that ATS's documents are available in all 4 treaty languages consistently, and that meetings allow for multilingual participation. Second, AI power tools. That's real-time machine translation and live transcription, which, even though they still don't work really well, they can make multilingualism much cheaper and faster. This is not futuristic, it's available now, and it could be tested in smaller ATS's committees before being scaled up. Third, support for non-English dominant nations, providing interpretation services, training, and resources can help level the play field. And finally, regional collaboration. Latin America needs to coordinate better, bridging Spanish and Portuguese, at least. A shared strategy could amplify the region's voice and strengthens its influence. Let me conclude with this thought. If we want Antarctic governance to be inclusive, language cannot remain invisible. Language equity is not just about communication, it's about identity, about visibility, and about power. For LATAM, the stakes are high. Without attention to linguistic equity, the region risks being sidelined and in critical discussions about science, environment, and governance. But with strategic multilingualism, with the help of AI, and with stronger regional collaboration, Latin America can play a much more influential role, I believe. So my argument is simple. Linguistic equity must be seen as a core dimension of equity, diversity, and inclusion in Antarctic governance. Thanks for your attention, and I welcome your questions. I should also add that I am relatively new to the field of Antarctic governance, so this work reflects an initial baby step into connecting linguistic equity with governance debates, and I truly welcome any comments, suggestions, or input to strengthen it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ileana. We will now open the floor for questions.
There is one question from Victoria Schneider to Ileana. It says, would you say that this linguistic situation is one of the causes for the problems for managing correctly tourism and conservation operation as a whole in Antarctica?
Thank you for that question. I definitely believe that this is a problem that permeates communication in general, either governmental, like the one I have focused on, but also when it comes to communication regarding tourism, regulations. But after decisions have been made in the ATCM, the communication of those decisions are also affected by the languages in which they are delivered. So I believe that by addressing linguistic equity, many aspects of Antarctica and everything related to it could be improved. I'm very optimistic about that. Yes.
Alejandra has now a question, please.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for each. I don't know if there's time, but I'll. Yeah, so thanks, Ileana. I enjoyed it. I was just wondering, would it help to look at the EU, for example, and what they do? Because my gosh, they have lots of languages. And if they manage well, maybe the Antarctic Treaty can get some ideas from there. But I don't know more than that, just a suggestion. And yeah, for Kati, shall I ask?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, just, yeah. And for Kati and Liz Marie, yeah, thanks. I would like to hear a bit more of why it is geopolitical, the decay, like why you add the word geopolitical at all? Yeah, so those are my two questions. Thanks.
Ileana, would you like to start with your answer first?
Oh, thank you. Alejandra, indeed, the European Union has many languages, like official languages, but the de facto language is also English. So basically, I would say that I haven't studied that case in particular. Some colleagues have, but it looks like the situation is basically the same.
Yeah, well, geopolitical, because it's related to territorial claims, clearly. To be able to show that you've been there for a very, very long time, it's basis for the territorial claims. And to be able to show them also on the hypothetical day that there is no Antarctic Treaty is extremely important, as is to be able to remove the signs of everybody else having been there. And this is the reason for why the list was drafted in 1972 to start with, but also the small acts of management to be able to show them. That's a very important geopolitical element in it.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I just want to add something a little bit, and that is what makes it really interesting, Alejandra, is the fact that very materiality of the things being there, not somewhere else, plays a very big role.
Yeah, thanks. I wish you could connect your research with, sorry, just very briefly, but with Melissa and Maria Jimena, they looked like you're working on the same, well, not exactly the same, but it's basically the same question. But yeah, thanks.
Source of inspiration as well. Yes, we know them well. Thank you.
There is another question to Katie. Very briefly, please, due to time. Could you please expand on the relation between decay and debris, and if there is any conversation about creating digital collections of existing physical sites, and those keeping the record of long-standing presence, but also committing to minimizing the human footprint?
Oh, that was many questions. Decay is a gradual process. Debris is a result of a quite complete process of decay, I would say. But this is off a CAP definition. There are, of course, projects that try to do digital scanning of heritage sites. Not surprisingly, these are not sealing sites. These are sites that have a lot of geopolitical importance. So my dream project would be to actually go and digitally scan everything what people don't want to scan, the governments don't want to scan, but that's for future, I suppose.
Okay, thank everyone for your question and participation. We'll now move on the next block. We continue with Elizabeth Lewis and the presentation Bearing Witness, Antarctica, Glacier Funerals, and the Climate Conscious Writer. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, we can't hear you. Your microphone is turned off and your video.
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, hello, and thank you all for being here and also for bearing and speaking and listening in English. I really appreciate that. In her latest book, Latitudes, Encounters with a Changing Planet, the writer, Jean McNeill, looks back on her life and asks, how much can we forget or bear witness to something as vast and dispersed as the Anthropocene? A cold, intimidating word for everything I have seen happen to nature in my very brief lifetime. The diminuendo of it, the subtraction and deletion and distortion. Her question distills one of the problems for the writer at a time of accelerated global loss. The position physically, intellectually, and emotionally of the individual writer's consciousness and effectiveness within the vast scales of impact and entanglement which make up the Anthropocene. The succession of words McNeill uses to point to what the Anthropocene means, diminuendo, subtraction, deletion, and distortion, hammer out its silences, losses, and unpredictable behaviours. This is grief expressed in the instrumental language of terminology and calculation. The fact that the loss is also personal is demonstrated by the other measurement, her own very brief lifetime. This too echoes the compression and confusion of scales evident in the Anthropocene, geological and personal timelines accelerating close. How much becomes how can we? An existential question for a writer caught between the impossibility of either forgetting the impacts of a rapidly changing climate or writing in a way which truly encompasses what is happening. The feeling of unravelling is now everywhere, says McNeill. Meanwhile, we do not know how to grieve for the world or to atone for what we have done to it. Is it too late for writers to make any difference? I'm going to look briefly at the presentation of Antarctica in two very different books, Latitudes, an episodic memoir by Jean McNeill, and The Edge of Solitude, a work of speculative fiction by Katie Hale. These books, both by climate-conscious writers, interrogate the role of the writer on a changing planet. I'm going to begin with a funeral. The Icelandic glacier Ökjökull was stripped of its glacier status in 2014. When a glacier has ceased to buckle under the burden of its own weight, when it has shrunk to the size of an ice field, it is effectively dead. In August 2019, a funeral was held to memorialise Ökjökull. It was attended by 100 people, including the Icelandic Prime Minister and a former UN Human Rights Commissioner. And it was an attempt to help people to process the loss of the glacier and what it meant not just for the local population, but for the world. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done, reads the memorial plaque. Only you know if we did it. The memorial is an act of bearing witness, not just to the passing of Ökjökull, but to the expected demise of all 200 of Iceland's other glaciers. It is a performative address to the future, captured in stone and in writing, which holds the present to account. What does it mean to bear witness? As you can see from the etymology of the phrase, its Old English roots contain both the idea of burden, something to be carried or endured, and of evidence or testimony, which found their way into religious discourse, disciples bearing witness to divine truth, and also into court practice. To bear witness is an individual act informed by individual experience, carried in the body, which has wider consequences. An individual story can provide important evidence for something which is bigger. The land, too, can bear witness, a fissure in the ground testifying to a previous earthquake. But to return to McNeill's question, how much can a writer bear witness to something as vast and dispersed as the Anthropocene? The literary philosopher Timothy Morton has defined the Anthropocene as something so vast and massively distributed in time and space relatively to humans that we can't perceive it whole. And its effects are felt differently in different places. Telling the story of climate change in a way which encompasses its complexity, nuances, timescales, and uncertainties challenges our traditional Western European conception of narratives. These are essentially linear, moving from a beginning through some sort of crisis towards an ending. But we are already in the middle of a distributed crisis in the Anthropocene. As for story, that word has come to have the same charge as vodka or crystal meth, wrote McNeill at the end of Latitudes. The engine which drives the narrative forwards, the conflict between protagonist and antagonist, is too simple, even potentially dangerous. What McNeill seeks instead is a way of telling the story of the land itself, of becoming attuned to its resonances and frequencies. Writing Antarctica is famously challenging. Language refused to organize itself around the land or whatever it was we were flying over, she wrote. In Ice Diaries and in Latitudes, McNeill analyzes her experience of the continent. Beyond broadcasting a voice, Antarctica has had a unique power, one I reflected on in the novel while failing to understand its effect on my own life. Antarctica was not a place, or not only, but a dimension. Once my characters knew the continent, they mutated into different people. Antarctica had a transformative effect on them and on me, although it would take me years after leaving the continent to identify its true nature, a possession. Latitudes is part of an ongoing process of interpreting that voice and that power. The episodes McNeill includes in Latitudes pay careful attention to different kinds of non-human languages which voice the land, the language of chemicals, the air as a speaking witness, the buzz of communication networks in trees, the physicality of the land as a language in itself. Morton's definition can be applied to Antarctica too, famously difficult to photograph, both dwarfing the human and needing the human figure to convey some sense of its scale. There are disruptions to linear time all around. However much Antarctica may be seen as the white continent or the last great wilderness, there is not one Antarctica but many. It embodies the scattered distribution of the Anthropocene. Finding ways to write about Antarctica, therefore, includes negotiating the problem of writing the Anthropocene. Writing Antarctica leads to another problem, gaining the experience which, whether rightly or wrongly, conveys authority. To know the world, to really know it in 3 dimensions, means burning a trail through the troposphere that singes the planet, wrote McNeill. Even when I became aware of the effects of what I was doing, I did not stop. The original title of Latitudes was an Anthropocene diary. McNeill resists the idea of story, choosing instead to present us with episodes from her travels, using her own lifetime of observations to record the extent of change, rather in the manner of Ponting's models, to convey a human scale. Fitting for work recording the Anthropocene, the timeline is disrupted. She moves between reflections in the near present, where widely dispersed locations between Africa, the poles, and Central and South America, and different periods of her life, act as geological movements and intrusions. McNeill's witness statement is a way of recording the story of the land. Bearing witness also provides the formal and thematic backbone of The Edge of Solitude by Katie Hale. In the novel, a disgraced activist and writer, Ivy Cunningham, is traveling to the Antarctic on board a cruise ship belonging to the multi-billionaire Sky, the man behind the responsive technology Intutech, which harvests data and uses it to provide people with what they want before they have to ask. Sky has devised a plan to save the Antarctic, and if it works, then the world. And it will save the world from the final ravages of climate change. He's asked Ivy on board the ship to write about the project. Ostensibly, he's asking for Ivy's support, but in fact, the journey is a test. The novel is Ivy's testimony and a witness statement to the world. In it, she puts herself on trial, the readers a judge and jury. There is a scene towards the end of the novel which underlines this. Ivy stumbles into a previously locked cabin and finds a record of her whole life's work projected onto the walls. I can't purge those images from my head, cacophonous, my entire life hurled against the wall as a flickering of light. But why and by whom? They felt like evidence gathered before a trial, collated, ready for sentences. Ivy calls the novel a guilting, not a witness statement. Guilting is her wife's word, and Ivy adapts it for her own purposes. Guilting is an acknowledgement, not a bargain for forgiveness. It shouldn't be a difficult load to bear. In fact, I wrote, that's the whole point of guilting, to manifest your guilt into a physical object so you no longer have to carry it in your heart. This concept was central to the piece of writing which established her reputation. Ivy went on to lead the life of a writer, hero, activist, campaigning just as long as it took to raise awareness and incite action and then moving on. But she forgot about the importance of the heart, of learning from your mistakes emotionally and practically. The writer is an individual deeply enmeshed in personal choices and place. To separate oneself from these, as Ivy does for the sake of the activist narrative, is to absent oneself from responsibility. The linear journey of the novel is towards Antarctica, but there are flashbacks of experiences circling back to the beginning. On the journey to Antarctica, in Antarctica, she's tried and fails. She begins her witness statement, her guilting in this significant environmental context. But the writer is Katie Hale, not Ivy. The location and structure of the work, as well as its plot and themes, show us a writer thinking about the purpose of writing at a time of accelerating climate change. The novel, in the novelist's view, is more nuanced and shows us a different kind of witnessing. Hale may be writing about the future, but it is a future based on the present. It's recognizable. The process of extreme weather events and sophisticated technological advancements are already happening, and the industrialization and exploitation of Antarctic waters is all too easy to imagine. The following lines are taken from the advertisement for Sky's Plan B. As the Lindenbrock drill method in the Arctic began to enable cheaper extraction from below the ice, so the eyes of the corporations turned south. National claims on Antarctic soil, which had lain dormant for decades, were re-established, then disputed. Like the voice of the Oakyoll Memorial, Hale's novel is a reckoning with the future. It offers us an opportunity to imagine differently. Writing about Antarctica helps us to do this. And in the end, this is the writer's role, to offer readers the chance to imagine with them, observe closely, listen carefully, and bear witness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Now we welcome Lucia Bolaniuk with the presentation Environmental Narratives and Antarctic Governance in the Anthropocene. Welcome, Lucia.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'm going to share my slides. Let me know if it's already visible.
Yes.
Good. Okay. First of all, I want to thank the organizers and of course all of you for being here today. This is my first time in SHAS, so I'm a little nervous, but mainly grateful to be here. Oh, I'm going to turn out the camera. Okay. I know we are on a tight schedule, and since English is not my main language, I've decided to read most parts of my presentation to make sure that it's clear and that I stick to the time limit, of course. Before I start, a brief disclaimer is in order. Of course, as we know, the term Anthropocene has been and is under dispute. I am, however, going to stick with Anthropocene because while I do believe this denomination holds fundamental tensions that require critical revision, I still think it allows us to stress the need for human responsibility in the climate and environmental crisis we face. Anyway, I would like to start with a quote from a book that inspired the reflections I'll be sharing today. I am referring to Anthropocene Antarctica, the brilliant volume edited by Elizabeth Lean and Jeffrey McGee. And I'm going to cite just the chapter they wrote, which says, If the Anthropocene signals the end of the idea of nature as a pure place, untouched by human hands, then the Antarctic, previously understood as the material embodiment of this ideal, faces a radical reframing. So this is the starting point of my analysis, the fact that at this crucial stage of the 21st century, Antarctic environmental narratives face reframing. Understanding, on the one hand, that, as the authors state, the Antarctic environment has been historically associated with this narrative of nature as pure, untouched. And on the other hand, following Stevens, considering that this epoch of global transformations and interdependent forces represents a revolution in the human-environment relationship, which can no longer be approached through the modern division between nature and human. The purpose of my work is to first dive into the classic interpretation of nature that enabled this environmental narrative, of which Antarctica has been a material embodiment of, to then explore which conceptual approaches could be more appropriate to frame our relationship to the Antarctic environment in these challenging times. So where does this idea of pristine, pure, untouched nature come from? And how does it relate to this modern division of the world into nature and human as separate domains? The etymological origin of the word nature is the Latin term natura, which can be traced back to the Greek word physis. While both originate in verbal forms denoting growth or birth, they differ in connotation and implications. The Latin natura derives from the combination of the verb nascor, which could be literally translated as the past participle born, and the suffix tura, which expresses concrete result of an activity. The Greek physis, on the other hand, comes from the verb phuo, phuein, which means to spring up, combined with the suffix sis, which denotes a process, an action. This distinction was explored in depth by philosopher Martin Heidegger in his Introduction to Metaphysics, where he traces the Greek etymology and defines nature as the very act of emerging, unfolding. At this point, you might be wondering, why do I bring up dead languages etymologies and a philosophy lecture from 1935 if I am mainly concerned with the future of Antarctica? Well, besides the fact that I work with what I have at hand, which in this particular time is continental philosophy, the truth is I value Heidegger's precision in pointing out the theoretical and practical consequences of anthropocentric ontology. With the prevail of natura over physis, in the meaning of the word nature, he says, beings are no longer asserted as such. Instead, they are just something completed, finished, and hence at disposal. Beings become the present at hand in which no world is whirling anymore, and instead human beings now steer and hold sway with whatever is at their disposal. What Heidegger's work ultimately reveals is that nature, physis, originally meant, and I quote, both heaven and earth, both the stone and the plant, both the animal and the human. But under the dominance of Western anthropocentric thought, nature, natura, becomes an object, separate from a human subject and at disposal, whether for observing or for making. Again, the question remains the same. How do these different conceptualizations of nature relate to Antarctic environmental narratives? And what can they tell us about Antarctic governance in the Anthropocene? Particularly since the Madrid Protocol entered into force, Antarctic environmental governance has developed on the basis of what Stevens has defined as the romantic environmentalism of wilderness. The problematic implications of this idea of wilderness have been briefly discussed earlier this morning during Dr. Hawkins' lecture. I'm not going to go deeper into that, just mentioning, and maybe we can further discuss it later on. But the main point here is that historically, the Antarctic treaty system has evolved around environmental narratives that define the Antarctic environment as a passive territory, isolated from the human, and bounded by the so-called Southern Ocean, turning Antarctica into an object for either exploring, exploiting, studying, or protecting, depending on historical human political decisions. However, in the era of climate change, the Antarctic environment reveals itself as active and hard to predict and control. Moreover, its ongoing material processes shape global futures on a planetary scale, driving the unfolding of threatening conditions for the sustainability of life on Earth. Now, if because of anthropogenic climate change, as Hemmings explains, the Anthropocene is defined as an Earth era in which human agency has become the prime mover, then we are left in a seemingly contradictory position. This is sustaining the human as prime mover of earthly phenomena without embracing human exceptionalism or understanding nature as a mere object. On which side lies agency, then? Well, on both. But responsibility to address the underlying causes, CO2 emissions mainly, and the consequences, climate change, sea level rise, and its effects on life on Earth, is on the human side. Understanding nature as species overthrows the assumption that our relations to the environment can be external, because we are part of the process of nature's active becoming. Nature, then, means both atmosphere and Earth's surface, both ice and lichen, both wildlife and human. Climate change has turned Antarctica into a key region. Conceiving the Antarctic environment as species stresses the idea that what is at stake in the mission to protect Antarctica is not only what happens between the South Pole and the 60-grade South Parallel, but how we live and how we will continue to live all around the planet. This, of course, has been discussed several times, and of course, earlier this morning as well regarding these discussions over the wilderness protection. But because, as Stevens points out, Antarctic governance faces this fundamental challenge, right, in responding to global environmental changes that are driven by activities not only in the Antarctic region, but outside these regions. And I believe we have reached the point in which this interconnectedness can no longer be ignored. So what does all of this mean? First of all, in my view, it means that addressing Antarctic environmental protection policy as geographically localized, this is isolated from global carbon politics mainly, can only be ineffective, that our institutions have to adapt and evolve to face this challenge. Of course, this is not to say that localized approaches, meaning efforts to improve environmental regulations and protocols for activities conducted in Antarctica, are not necessary. In fact, this must exist and be updated based on the best available scientific evidence. What I'm saying is we should at least perceive as an incoherence the fact that within the consultative members of the Antarctic Treaty, there are countries that are among the world's largest carbon emitters. That climate action discussions within the Antarctic Treaty system have so far remained superficial. What I'm saying is that climate action must become a priority within the ATS, especially facing the potential review of the Madrid Protocol in 2048. That the Antarctic Treaty has a role to play in the transition towards a more sustainable way of living on this planet. What I'm saying is that the Antarctic Treaty system should embrace decarbonization as part of its core value of environmental protection among scientific research and international cooperation. Of course, this is a highly complex issue and a very hard goal to achieve, considering negotiations take time and lots of efforts. But I believe if the treaty has successfully kept the Antarctic continent peaceful and safeguarded from nuclear and military operations in the middle of the high geopolitical tensions of the Cold War, then why wouldn't it be able to step up for this challenge right now? I would like to finish with a quote by Juan Francisco Salazar, which also closes this book I mentioned in the beginning. And in this chapter, he says, Antarctica has always presented itself as a serious test for humanity's coordinated capacity to exercise foresight. If Antarctica, as Juan Francisco says, is generative of politics, and the Anthropocene requires a new kind of politics, end of quote, the Antarctic Treaty System can and must lead the way to new global politics that approach climate action with responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia and Elizabeth, for your presentations. Now we will open the floor for questions.
We have a few minutes to make questions to Elizabeth and Lucia. Is there anyone who wants to ask something to them? It seems that we don't have questions this time, so thank you very much, Elizabeth and Lucia. We will come back soon at 12:30 to start with Alejandra. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we continue with Alejandra Mancilla and the presentation Indigenous Voices in Antarctic Governance. Welcome, Alejandra.
Great, thank you. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thanks for staying. It's been a bit of a marathon, so I appreciate you being here. Yeah, so I'll jump straight into this. This topic that I'm going to present today is really something that is coming from a book that I'm working on, or really I'm ready with the book, but it's going to be coming out, I think, hopefully in spring 26. And the title of the book is From Sovereignty to Guardianship, Governing Antarctica, Governing the World. And the main claim of that book is that and the Antarctic Treaty System and the political system in Antarctica has been unique and great in many ways. And you are all Antarcticans, so I don't need to explain much about that. But at the same time, I see two problems that cut throughout the system and international law in general. And you could even say political philosophy and even moral philosophy, which are what I call methodological nationalism and methodological anthropocentrism. So very briefly, the idea with methodological nationalism is that when we start thinking about political society, we immediately think of states as the natural units of political organization. And therefore we tend to forget, or we tend to ignore other possible ways of organizing ourselves and, well, maybe others too, politically. And on the other hand, methodological anthropocentrism is basically a bias whereby when we ask questions of how to organize society, how to organize ourselves politically, ourselves are always humans. And that again leaves out other actors, maybe not agents in the sense of fully fledged moral agents, but other actors that we should consider. And I'm thinking here of non-humans and nature, maybe even too. So that's one part of the where this is coming from. In the context of the book, I have a couple of chapters where I ask how could we do this? So what would it look like to represent non-human animals first, or maybe nature at large, Antarctica? That's where it connects with the second little note that I have there, antarcticrights.org. So I'm a part of the working group of this Antarctic Rights Initiative that I'm sure many of you know. And for those who don't, please check the webpage. The idea is to give Antarctica legal standing because we think that Antarctica is affected by decisions that are made politically at the global level, and yet it doesn't have a voice. It's not that it doesn't. Antarctica does have a voice, but we don't listen to it. So anyway, this is where this is coming from. And in that context, and this is where the title here, if you notice, changed. So what I'm really going to talk about is what the role of indigenous voices should be in the representation of Antarctica, not Antarctic governance generally. So very briefly, I will not say much about why representation rather than something else. So this could come in the Q&A, but obviously one could think that the environmental protocol and its associated instruments are enough to safeguard the Antarctic environment, and why should we have on top of this some other convention or declaration, as we call it, Antarctic Declaration, saying that Antarctica should be represented by someone as an independent unit. Very briefly, I think that the problem with the alternatives are that they keep this methodological anthropocentrism in place, and statism, by the way, nationalism. So if we think that Antarctica is its own community of life, and that we should stand in relation towards Antarctica and nature in general in a more horizontal way and not in a hierarchical way as we have done so far, then it seems that the solutions that we have at the moment are insufficient and inadequate. So that's why we think, or well, I think here, I'm not talking on behalf of the group, let's be clear, this is my position, but I think because of these discussions, what I say here is very much connected to what we have been discussing. Representation is the way to go. So who should be the representatives of Antarctica, and what should be the relationship to Antarctica? So there is a lot of, or well, not a lot, but some work on representing nature in political philosophy, but most of it is based on liberal democracies and domestic levels. There is very little or nothing on what happens when we move to the global level. And what is fascinating about the case of Antarctica is that it requires this double leap of imagination, because we're no longer thinking of local natural entities, we're thinking of a whole continent, and we're saying, well, maybe that continent should have some sort of status vis-a-vis other states. So moving beyond both anthropocentrism and statism/nationalism. Now, the representatives for nature, many people have suggested that it should be those who know. So many people think of scientists, people that have the expertise of the place, and also those who care. And here we can have activists, artists, filmmakers, even journalists, anyone who has a genuine disinterested interest, to put it that way, in the place. And I am not a Kantian, but I think that Immanuel Kant's distinction between things and persons is very useful here. So Kant has this idea that we should never treat persons just as means, but also as ends. So when I have a friend, I can use my friend in many ways, but I also value my friend because of who she is, full stop. In the same way, I think that those who should represent Antarctica, or any other natural entity for that matter, should be people who have this same approach to the subject matter. So people who are interested in Antarctica, not only as a means, but also as an end. So not just because of the instrumental value that it may hold for us, but also because we consider it well, maybe not a person, but an entity that has its own good and its own, that matters in itself. So very briefly, this is where the indigenous voices come in. We have been discussing this also in the group, but this is part of what I say in the book a little bit. I would like to say more. I think that we should start by where not to start. So when we think of what role indigenous voices should play in Antarctic governance, or more precisely in Antarctic, in the representation of Antarctica, I think that it would be a bad idea to replicate the logic of those that made territorial claims in Antarctica at some point. And here I have two arguments in mind. So one would be to say we were there first. What I'm thinking here is of a paper that appeared a few years ago, claiming that maybe, or suggesting rather, that maybe it was some Maori sailors who arrived in Antarctica before anyone else. And there was a heated debate around this. There were responses saying that there was not evidence enough about this. And my reaction to that debate was, so what? Why would it matter, if it mattered at all, that it was Maori sailors rather than anyone else who came first? The second argument that I would also avoid is to say, well, we should look at which indigenous groups live in those countries that are contiguous to Antarctica, even if we are incredibly far. But should they have a special say in this or not? So I think that we were the first, so this argument of discovery and occupation, and we are the closest, so just by virtue of physical proximity, are not good grounds to start. Another reason would be to say, as I mentioned there, what about indigenous peoples that are very much affected by Antarctica's changing climate? So people in Tuvalu were going to probably lose the whole territory because of sea level rise, which happens because Antarctica is melting. I think I would say that those groups maybe have something to say in Antarctic governance more generally, but for them, not necessarily, but at least if the argument is because they are sinking because of climate change, that argument would be purely instrumental, and it would not necessarily mean that they take Antarctica to be an end in itself. So where to start then? I think that traditional ecological knowledge would be extremely valuable in shaping Antarctic governance, in helping to shape Antarctic governance. Here again, I'm not saying something new. So Priscilla Wehi and other authors have this paper about how Maori values can inform the policy of the New Zealand Antarctic program, and how this is positive because they have a much more, they have a different ontology in which nature and humans are not in opposition and are not in a hierarchy, but are interconnected, and this relationship is based on respect. So I think that would definitely help. those who care, well, we normally think that some indigenous philosophies have been particularly good at promoting what we now call environmental values. I'm not saying that all of them are, but some are. And maybe we should look at that too. And the other thing is that for those who are skeptical about the representation of nature in general, because nature cannot speak and cannot name someone and cannot object to the representative, there has been an evolution in the research on representation, on political representation. And there are these interesting suggestions that when we think of political representation, even for humans, we're not really thinking that the representative mirrors or translates exactly what the interests of the represented are, but rather they create discourses or they represent discourses. Here again, I think that the role of indigenous worldviews would be extremely important because they bring to the table discourses that we have not heard yet or that have not been present yet. I will very briefly say that, just not to say that I'm not going to say anything about the how. So I have not got as far as saying this is how this should be implemented. I know this is a big question and it's fascinating and we're discussing how this could be done. Again, this is something really new in the sense that it is about giving legal rights to an entity, rights which would be recognized in global fora, so at the international level. This is a big leap from rights of nature and how they have been developed so far, which is basically at national levels, in domestic constituencies. I've gone super fast, so to make sure that I'm on time. And yeah, as concluding remarks, I would really like to say that I would appreciate questions, suggestions, and comments. This is very much work in progress, both in terms of the research and also in terms of what happens as part of this group of Antarctic Rights. So thanks a lot for listening, and yeah, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Now, to finish this morning session, we would like to introduce Emily Pilon, who is going to present Through the Telescope Lens and Afar Relationships with Antarctica. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, welcome. I can't share my screen right now, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
It should be all right. Okay, perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present a little bit of my work. I'm Émilie Pilon. I'm a PhD student in anthropology at the LAA La Vue, a laboratory of Paris-Nanterre University, France. As a part of my PhD, I followed scientific communities to describe how they belong to what I called an infrastructure of research and how this infrastructure of research is making Antarctica last as a territory laboratory, so as a place of science. So to put it here, I haven't been to Antarctica. Today, I will focus on a part of my multi-sited ethnography, a remote fieldwork carried between March and October 24 alongside OTI, a research program. This presentation benefits from the FAST seminar held at the Scott Polar Research Institute and is also partially based on a paper that is actually under review and will be hopefully published in Le Journal des Anthropologues. So first, I will introduce you to OTI and my fieldwork. Then I will talk you through the concept of chronotope and how it participates to bring Antarctica into existence beyond its physical geography. So OTI is one of the French astronomy program in Concordia. It's the French astronomy program in Concordia. It's an almost fully automated telescope, remotely controlled by the French team. It is installed in a dome meters away from the station main building. It's looking at faraway stars to observe the transit of exoplanets and hopefully confirm their existences. The project, as I know it, is in place since 2019. So during 8 months, I was able to attend OT's weekly meeting. Plus, I was added into the WhatsApp group and I had a chance to do interviews with the scientific team. The meetings are held online for a convenient reason. A part of the team is in the UK and it allows the winter over astronomer to attend the meeting as well. So sometimes we were very lucky because we were able to see a corner of Antarctica sky through our screens. I was the only one very ecstatic about it. The meeting are shared by the team approach several topics. They usually start with Concordia general news given by the winterer. The team asks if everything is all right, if they notice something wrong, and the meeting became a place for the winterer to discuss their experiences and everyday personal and professional worries. They also usually check the weather condition, which is a recurring subject because it directly impacts their observation, as well as the possibility for the winterer to go outside and to clean the telescope. They are able to access the weather condition and to monitor the temperature of some part of the instrument. Some of them are heated up and the changes could mean that something is wrong. It's part of all the devices put in place to watch the telescope from afar. The meeting is a moment where they can discuss any issues that require the whole team and plan the next summer campaign. For example, there was an issue during an observation. An email alert was sent to A, who is the telescope dad. He was able to log into OT's control software, but had to manually adjust the focus not to lose the night. They didn't know where this issue came from, so during the next meeting, A shared his screen. Then he accessed Concordia's computer, then the webcam monitoring the telescope that you can see up here. With the input and the hypothesis of everyone, was it a mechanical issue, was it a bug in the software, they were able to identify what the issue could be, schedule a meeting with the winterer to resolve it. Last but not least, the meeting is a place where they discuss the result of their observation and plan the next one. They talk about their failure or what appears to be a failure. One time, for example, they missed a transit. It meant that the transit didn't happen as scheduled. For them, it meant that something else was disturbing the signal and potentially another planet. So it could be good news. If we found it, we'll be the only one to know where it is. This led to a 2-day observation, the kind you can only do in Antarctica. There is also success, for example, an 8-hour-long transit, very typical of Antarctica, that will be an easy paper. I quote, it's just some plot and saying that Antarctica is great. So let's rewind a little bit. The meeting, as a specific space and time, became an observation window for me. Their description, very briefly shared here, creates a narrative of the campaign. We know since O'Reilly that meetings are a place where an idea of Antarctica is shaped, even inhabited, by its community. One of the keys of my work is to consider the meeting as chronotope and their redescription as a chronotopy. A chronotope is a specific and inextricable bound between a place and its singular temporalities. So what were the chronotopes experienced in this narrative of a campaign? So far, I've identified 3 of them, but it's still a work in progress. So first, there is the chronotope of science. The intrinsic characteristic of Antarctica creates a unique place to do astronomical observation. OT's whole history is about creating and accessing Antarctica sky. It began with the creation of an observation time for astronomy, which required to qualify the place and its atmospheric condition. Then, to create a sustainable scientific program to install a telescope. OT is the product of more than 20 years of constant effort to create and make relevant Concordia's night. So the chronotop of science is about the creation of Concordia's night. It's what held valuable here. The night is a continuous time, a block that is unique but seasonal, because the team needs long-term and recurring observation to be able to publish. It escapes the usual time measurement, even using another scale, such as the barycentric coordinate time. By creating a night and adding values to it, it creates the possibility of losing it. Not losing the night then became a challenge that relies on a lot of care and attention surrounding the telescope. So obviously the second chronotop is the chronotop of the telescope. The temporality of the telescope is punctuated by connection and deconnection of the team to the monitoring device and the acquisition software, either as a response to an alert, to do a checkup, or because there is an observation happening. The telescope is a complex technical object made from an instrument, a connection, internet connection, a software, and even the winterer. It is not only, and I quote Madeleine Ackrich, a necessary mediator in all our relationship with reality. It became a space itself. For example, back from holiday, I once say, I haven't been here all week. So the chronotop of the telescope is an interface with Antarctica. As I said, the winterer is part of the system. He is the last link, the eye and the end of OT in Antarctica. So through the meetings, I was able to witness important moments and rituals of the winter over experiences, for example, the midwinter. But to me, what was more interesting was the temporality of the winterer which is shown during the meeting, is more about validation of and unique experiences. More precisely, the meeting became a place where N can share his experiences and his difficulties and see them validated by A and G, who are both Antarctic veterans. A and G spent more than 15 summer campaigns in Antarctica and have been through at least one winter over at Concordia. So together they share their memories and their own experiences, and they created a narrative, the narrative of the natural cycle of the winter over experiences, one that N can't escape. So to finish, so to me, the meeting, both as a chronotop and the chronotopy, allow us access to Antarctica's real time, le temps réel, as a way to close the physical distance by sharing unique temporalities. That allows the team to be there in this kind of in-between space. Real time could hold different meanings. It could be the observation time with all its uncertainties. It's the real-time access through the internet connection to the telescope, allowing an immediate responses, or the one validated by the community. The three chronotop gave us three different layers of Antarctica existence beyond its geographical boundaries, as the night, the interface, and the place of memory. It called for reconfiguration of the relationship we are as a part of the broad scientific communities entertaining with Antarctica from afar. It belongs to me, to the everyday maintenance of that is making Antarctica last as a place of science, as a laboratory for our past and our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily and Alejandra, for your presentations. Now we will open the floor for questions.
We have a few minutes to make questions to Alejandra or Emily. Does anyone want to ask something?
Okay, thank everyone for your questions and participation. We will now take a lunch break and we'll be back at 14. In the meantime, we invite you to explore the pre-recorded presentation available for on-demand viewing. Thank you very much.